Hello, listener. Come on in. Come on in. Welcome to our imaginary house or dining room where we've got a nice comfy chair for you. We've got, a roaring fire. We've got, stuffed alligators hanging from the rafters. Come on in. Come on in.
That terrifies me. I am perfectly fine with the broadcasting of the signal from some unknown bunker. It made me think, it was like, that sounds distinctly like, a Ronald Hutton affectation, but I feel like he always shows up somewhere in costume, but never, you don't see his own home.
Consistently voted historian most likely to actually be a Time Lord.
Yes, absolutely. Welcome to another episode of Radio Free Golgotha. Golgotha, however. There is some comfort that even in the Golgotha hymn, they do pronounce it in several languages to be like, just so you know what we're talking about.
Right. It's a very you see that approach in the Picatrix, right? Of the very ecumenical theology of you who are called so-and-so by so-and-so people, and also this by these people. Yeah, interesting. Good stuff.
So this is, I believe, episode 26 of the show, and we are blessed and privileged to have Jay Hamade here.
Hello.
And my name is Jesse. If you don't know, hi. You'll regret this. And
hiya, I'm Al. It's nice to be here, even if we're going to regret it.
But Jay, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I go by Jay, but also JM, mostly in written forms. I am an artist, an astrologer, writer, teacher, based out of New York City, focusing on traditions of image magic, but also broader senses of that term, of the magic of images, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about today in relationship to the Lunar Mansions. And I tend to focus on Lunar Mansions, fixed stars, and there's a lot of crossover with those traditions and magical images in particular. I have a podcast. I am a grad student. I'd say that about sums it up.
Awesome.
And you're an excellent person to go on holiday with. I can definitely attest to that.
Friend of the host. Friend of the host.
Yeah, yes. having trooped round bits of Italy together. Yeah, it was awesome to go adventuring with you.
Our Sesame Streeting for the day. I do hope that we can use that. It's guaranteed, right? So it's legal.
I feel it comes under fair use.
Okay, so our list of topics for the day, which is cultivated. Sometimes in the past we totally randomized it, but then we realized, why not make it somewhat already with connections that are there. Right. And one of our ways to entice guests is to say, you already know some of these topics. So there is, it wasn't just random. But this is for the feast of the Archangel Gabriel, and old style feast, because this is intended for March 18th. There's also a March 24th feast, and both of those were kicked off the calendar in favor of just putting all the angels with Michaelmas on the 29th of September after Vatican II. So with much fond memory of Gabriel getting his own day, happy feast of the Archangel Gabriel, pre-1921. And our saint of the day is not a dead person. This is less necromantic and more, I guess, is it still necromantic when it's an angel?
Depends if you're sacrificing things to the angel or not, basically.
Always sacrificing. I sacrifice this time right now. And cross-culturally, I think Gabriel's a wonderful one to look at, just because of his prominence in all three branches of the Abrahamic faiths. As a demon of the day, we're going hardcore and going with Iblis. So this is big. It's a big topic. And the herb, wow, I'm doing it British. The herb of the day is lily, the flower, the fleur de lis. The stone or mineral is jade. The style of magic is Lunar Mansions, of which we have the privilege of having Jay here with.
The tarot arcana of the episode is the moon, appropriately. The geomantic figure we're going to talk about is populous, and therefore it's correspondingly similarly shaped and occasionally counterparted Odu of Oyeku. And our dead magician is Ibn Arabi. I'm very excited to talk about some of his work.
Woot woot. Y'all gave me the list. I could not resist.
It was all on purpose. The seduction of the basilisk.
Yep.
So we will proceed according to the preordained route, following Lord Summerisle, starting with the saint, and so the Archangel Gabriel, Jibrīl. So there's a lot here. Please feel free to interject and take over at any point. But generally, I feel like this is one of the most known saint in the very, like, also just to start off, like in the Hispanic sense, like when we say saint, it doesn't imply a dead person, but in English, we really feel like it has to imply a dead person.
Yeah. And I've been going through a bunch of stuff, Protestant diatribes really against Catholic ritual at the moment, looking at exorcism and dispossession across the early modern period. And there's big problems with the idea of calling the archangels saints, because they weren't people. That's very much tied to the Protestant take, is like a saint has to have died and been a person, and even then we're pretty suspect of them.
So Gabriel, as well, we have no idea if Gabriel is actually a dead person, because I guess supposedly that might depend on its the cosmologies that are talking about it. But on the strictest sense, angels are non-free-willed entities made of light.
Right. And Gabriel is one of the big three, along with Raphael and Michael.
Yes.
When an angel is named in scripture, at least in the Christian Bibles, and said that there's an angel, but it isn't named who the angel is, which is rare anyway. If the angel is giving a message of some kind, it's almost always said eventually in like folk hagiography to be, or folk angelology, I suppose, said to be Gabriel or Jibrīl.
So prominently, right, the message of Zacharias of the birth of John the Baptist is announced by, and Gabriel identifies himself there, and also describes his office as, assisting before the face of God, which is in order to deliver the message that the very ancient Elizabeth is going to give birth. Right. And similarly, Gabriel's feast in March heavily has to do with the Annunciation, that we are 9 months before December. And therefore, this is in the lovely seasonal pairing that happened by medieval Christianity in Europe of aligning the fecundity of Mary and the reawakening of Jesus even post death is tied to the seasonal round of the Northern Hemisphere. Yeah. So spring awakening, pun intended, of Mary's overshadowing by the Holy Spirit, that Gabriel is the messenger, and that lore itself of Gabriel being there at the birth actually plays heavily into Islamic lore. And some things that Ibn Arabi had voluminous amounts of things to write on, but most notably too in modern Christianity, which is not biblical, but we do see it, is that Gabriel is the one who will announce the end times, specifically by blowing the trumpet, which will raise the dead. Right. So this, as far as necromantic properties, Gabriel has an instrument that raises dead, which is fascinating. And there's a few other like feasts that are associated with him, like definitely the Church of England got on board with the Catholic Church and was like 29th of September is fine for all the angels. And then the Eastern Orthodox Church does celebrate the feast day of the Synaxis of the Archangel Michael and the other bodiless powers, which I just think is a fantastic name.
Synaxis already sounds like some darkwave band, and I'm into it.
But other bodiless powers it's wonderful. That's the 8th of November, and that's the Julian day. So we are looking at the currently falls on the 21st of November. And so you're looking at this other thing, 26th of March, 13th of July, Gabriel is just a very important one. I think what's interesting in the Orthodox Church is that the 13th of July feast also plays into Gabriel's continued miracles in the Christian community. So including those post-biblical times in the 9th century, in the 11th century, in the 15th century, those miracles that are attributed to Gabriel are celebrated and part of the formal recognition on those days. So Gabriel is my strength is in God, or God is my strength, sometimes said to be God is great or God is powerful. There is a connotation where Gabriel iconography or heraldry, as I think you love that term, Al, of white and blue, which echoes the Virgin Mary's blue, and does speak of the kind of the peaceable sky in that way, the non-stormy sky. And it does, we have this trifold division, Old Testament wise, of like something going into battle is usually attributed to Michael, something announcing is usually Gabriel, and something interactingly and especially healing or bringing reparations is Raphael. But Gabriel is distinctly also named as a warrior for Israel, and as a great warrior. So, and you would think that being strength of God, that would be helpful. The flower of the day is chosen because it is also something that we associate with Gabriel, which is the lily. And so there's a lot of things that'll flow between all of this.
I am interested in this distinction that we're talking about, and this connotation that comes up in English about a saint, and whether this is a dead person. Doesn't have to necessarily be a dead person or not, because it comes up in Arabic as well. And I was having this conversation recently with Arabic speaking family of mine, and I was like, is there a good term for saint in Arabic? And at least in the Levantine Arabic that is of my family that I'm familiar with, there really wasn't a good answer. I mean, in Morocco, you have terms like Sidi, you'll oftentimes hear for a saint or a holy person, but I mean, there's terms like wali as well, sometimes sheikh, but these are also, or hakim, which is like a wise person or a doctor, but these are less speaking towards like what we would consider to be a saint, especially in the context of a dead person. And this is something I came up time and time again in trying to classify al-Khidr, who maybe we'll touch on Khidr a little bit more throughout the conversation, but is often referred to as the green saint in Islam, and is referred to as a saint, but is not really a dead person, because he's also alive, but he's not really alive, meaning he's not incarnate, though he partakes of this complicated liminal in-between, which you would call barzakh. But yeah, I don't think it's really all that simple in Islam as well, though Jibrīl would not be considered a saint in the sense that we understand it, even if we're not like playing around with this person as living or dead, because Jibrīl is pretty much in the category of archangel, along with three others, Mikael, who we talked about, and the other two being Azrael and Israfil. Israfil taking on more of the position that you mentioned of blowing the horn on judgment in the Islamic tradition. Israfil also being considered to be the closest to God in many Muslim understandings of the four primary archangels, and Azrael being essentially the angel of death, who there's a lot of really great connections between Azrael and some Samael and Iblis, interestingly enough, as being like an angelic figure who has been given the power through God to essentially reap souls and sometimes even tempt human beings.
There's a great kind of overlap there too within specifically like mainland Spanish Catholicism, where many churches incorporate the angel of death as a fourth power. And it's interesting because in many modern ceremonial magic contexts, we're gonna follow the lead of the apocryphal books of Enoch, right? And put Uriel in there as following the trends of many like late 19th century, early 20th century occultists, right, as a angel of the north and the earth and silence and all these things. But the Muslim inclusion of the angel of death, I am not a Franco fan by any means because of my other joys in Spain, the cultures that I do enjoy. But Franco's tomb, the Valle de los Caídos, is one of the most incredibly awestruck moments I've had in a church. It's in the top of an ancient Christian site where hermits used to go from, like, I think the 1st and 2nd century, but they hollowed out a hill. They took the stone from that hill and made the cross on top. That's huge. But you go in it and it's just mausoleums off the side and tombs of the people who died under Franco's on his side. So tombing the fallen dead. And you get through this incredibly long passageway, which the church is shaped like a cross, as many places are. And you're directly under the top of the mountain at that point. And the altar is in the center, and they have this beautiful dome that has this gold-backed mosaic that's awestruck. But it also has these, in my head, they're 50, but they're probably like 15 to 20 foot tall, 4 angels witnessing the altar, one of whom is the angel of death, specifically. And this notion of this kind of Muslim inclusion into Spanish Catholicism is something we're going to see quite a bit if you actually examine. I like that play on it. As far as Jibrīl, and there's a lot of things that I would love to kind of geek out about, but the thing that always stood out for me of the Jibrīl claimed Islam, right? And Michael claimed Christianity.
Yeah, totally.
In the way, in this kind of solar lunar thing that I think we've touched on before, Al, many moons ago. Funny, but that, if you're a desert people, the moon is a friend, and the sun is not. And if you're of the northern climb, the sun is very much friend. So Jibrīl being the messenger or this defender of the faith, but also the one that comes to Muhammad, peace be upon him, and says Iqra, recite. And the Quran starts with this command from Jibrīl to do something that an illiterate man does not know how to do, and the power in what that is, and that the mystical nature of the word Iqra itself, and the beginning and ending with the sword of Aleph.
It's interesting to bring up the notion of the solar and the lunar and Michael and Gabriel. Rereading text that was published through Revelor, myself and Dr. Amina Enlow's The Shamsama Arif by Ahmed al-Buni, who was a contemporary and even most likely shared a teacher with Ibn Arabi. So there's some interesting crossover there. But there is this notion in the text, and I'm not sure where else it appears in the tradition, or if it appears elsewhere in the tradition. But there is this notion of the moon once being akin to the light of the sun, or even stronger, even brighter than the sun. And the wings of Gabriel essentially blotting out portions of the moon to diminish its light. And in the same way, this is like through the intervention of Jibrīl for God in creating these cross sections of the moon with the shadows of his wings. This is where we get the notion of the Lunar Mansions and the letters derived from the Lunar Mansions would take on such a big import in the tradition, the magical tradition in particular, and also in relevance to things like ilm al-huruf wal-asma, the traditions of lettrism and using the numbers and letters for magic and for mystical thought. But I mean, this is relevant to, of course, bringing up Jibrīl as the revealer with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, of the Quran, and these initial 5 verses that you mentioned, Iqra, the 96th surah of the Quran, typically, and Iqra being read, but also this notion of the clot, or the alaq. Surah al-alaq is also referred to, the clot or the embryo which human beings are formed out of, which is the name for the surah. And this is, I mean, there's the alif, of course, which is the pen or the qalam, which is mentioned in that same surah of the Quran, which God inscribes destiny into the book of nature. but this primordial dot, or this embryo which humanity is shaped from, is the same dot referred to in the tradition, typically ascribed to Ali, who was married to Fatima, the Prophet Muhammad's daughter. And in this tradition, there's this notion of the dot under the letter ba, which is the letter B, and everything going back to this letter. The entirety of the Quran, going all the way back to the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, all the way to that first B and the dot under the letter B, everything. So this embryo in which the entirety of the Quran, but also the entirety of humanity, the entirety of the cosmos as we know it, emerges, is all in this initial revealed surah of the Quran by Jibrīl. And I think you can still take that back to this division of the light of the moon. And as Jibrīl says, Iqra, read to the Prophet Muhammad, it is to be able to read the signs in nature, which I hope we talk more about it with Ibn Arabi and the concept of the perfected man or the perfected person, insan al-kamil. But it is thought that the perfected person is able to read the signs in nature that are left by God, including the shapes of the moon, which form the letters which become the Arabic language, which are the Quran, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They definitely want to get into perfected man stuff. I had a little dive through that today. Yeah, definitely want to get onto that. In terms of speaking the language of nature, one of my favorite offices, if we want to put it like that, of Gabriel, of Jibrīl, not only as a bearer of revelation to prophets and this close sacred relationship with Muhammad, peace be upon him, and these various biblical appearances of revealing of interpreting dreams for Daniel, of announcing births of John the Baptist, of Jesus, of Isaac to Abraham. Along with all that, there's a bunch of Muslim ideas around Jibrīl having appeared to Adam generally post-banishment and showing him ironworking and wheat farming and writing in some contexts. And this is also tied up to like Enoch and Idris, also being supposedly a progenitor of writing. But it's Gabriel as first teacher of geomancy that obviously interests me as like teaching a language of nature. I was reading Blanca Villeneuve, I don't know if I'm saying that surname right, talking about the tales intended to explain the divine nature of the science of geomancy. And it provides these chain of transmitters, usually headed by Jibrīl. As a master of knowledge, he gives the prophet Idris the chance to learn and transmit it to humans. The angel and the prophet are said to have to meet several times until he's mastered the techniques. And then he teaches it to the Indian sage Tumtum al-Hindi, and he's like has a whole other legacy of his own of being this wise geomancer. He is relatively unknown though until the arrival of Caliph al-Babari, the elder, who's a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad. And al-Babari is said to have studied it in India for like hundreds of years, or like 120 years, and then he writes a book, and that's bestowed upon his disciple al-Babari the younger. And the list usually ends with the most famous geomancer Abu Aban ala Muhammad al-Zanati, following his master. And there are other cases where the mythical transmitters are substituted for other ones. Idris has been assimilated to Hermes Trismegistos by many writers, as well as like Thoth, the prophet Daniel, Enoch, and sometimes even instead of Tumtum al-Hindi, you find them talking about it being taught to Ptolemy. And in other examples, you have like the Sibyl, Pythagoras, Abraham, Moses, and even Christ. But this idea that the angel of annunciation and revelation doesn't just tell you news, they also give you the means to understand the things you've already seen or have had revealed to you. And again, thinking about like not just the appearance, but the interpretation of Daniel's dream in those contexts is really fascinating to me.
Absolutely. I know we've geeked out on that a few times, Al. The Idris with the Idris Enoch connection with threading in particular, and the connection with
but he's a tailor. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I kind of go on and on about this sometimes, and I think people they don't really get what I'm talking about most of the time, but I continue to go on and on about it anyways. But like geomancy is referred to sometimes the khata ramal, or like cutting of the sand, and the khat, or the cut, just like a line or thread, khat and khayt being Arabic words as such. This is the line which emerges from that primeval dot, right? And this, you see this with Arabic calligraphy. This is discussed by Hallaj in the Sufi tradition and others. But the line in Arabic calligraphy emerging from the same primordial dot, humanity emerging from this primordial dot, as well as the geomantic figures, of course, the figures of Ramal, which emerge from the same primordial dot. And this is the way we conceive of the figures, or we imagine the figures as the dot, which is then becomes the line, or a series of dots or a series of lines, but all going back to that same single dot, right? But I'm glad you brought up this connection going all the way back to Jibrīl. It's important, of course.
It also gives a lovely justification for the validity of Khat or Ramal within Muslim society, where divination can sometimes be viewed as tricky. And so to have one that is sanctioned and comes from an origin that is also not the origin of the Quran, but an impetus, let's say, or a call to have the Quran come forth.
Exactly.
There's that story about the end of time when Muhammad, peace be upon him, goes before the angels, and it's the end of time and things are dying. We've talked about this with the angel of death, Al, who is in that scenario and is the last angel to actually die before the end of time. But the first angel he meets is Jibrīl, because he's seen Jibrīl twice in life. Like Jibrīl revealed his full splendor to Muhammad, peace be upon him. But the notion that Jibrīl has never seen Allah and does everything on faith, does everything on this is what I'm commanded to do, so I do it. And that Jibrīl and the angels themselves are the perfect submitters to the will of God, which there's something really that always struck me about that, of like the devotion of this angel. Also, selfishly, because that's although it's supposed to be a dead person, many of us take angel names as confirmation names, and we use the earthly saint as a mask for the angelic force. But so Gabriel, Giba, which is funny because that means devil in Portuguese. Gabriel is a wonderful thing. I also like what it makes me think of when you talk about the clot and the primordial clots of the notation, the right of marking odds and evens to find what the figures are going to be. That within this place, the mothers, why mothers? Because they're generative, right, and produce more past them. But that it ties together mothers, and even when we talk about Odu as womb and the womb of potential, the clots that form that which is going to give life, what we see coming to term when we are reading. And the figures that give us an arrangement of or at least the shape like humans. Anthropomorphized figure itself becomes even more evident if you're going to compare the earliest dots of the act of geomancy itself to the clot that becomes human. And so I think there's some really beautiful poetry of thought linking all of that together.
Absolutely.
The thing with Jibrīl, which is going to overlap, of course, because with Ibn Arabi, there's an exploration. There's a wonderful Ibn Arabi Society podcast, which just has a lot of people reading amazing papers in very, very low voice. So you have to like turn up your headphones all the way. But one of them was going into Ibn Arabi's explorations of his understanding of what it is to be a saint, in which case that the holy men or the friends of God, let's say, all are incarnations or permutations or exclamations of one of the 99 names of God. And that every person in their potential to be a friend of God is also tied to one of the 99 names. And in so much as this, in the 99 names, even the separation of this is viewed to Jibril's cutting, right? The 600 wings that he has of constantly trying to keep holiness, that he's referred to as the keeper of holiness, the consoler of man, That like Adam in his despair afterwards, is so desperate to try and figure out, and he's not sure if he can live anymore. And Jibrīl is the one that's like, no, you move on. And the ability for Jibrīl to cut us from the past that keeps us too weighed down, that we can only remember pain so much, is a Jibrīl artifice. But so if we are all emanations, and especially the prophets, therefore, and if Isa or Jesus is going to be a prophet, which he is acknowledged as, then he must be an emanation of one of the names of God. And for him, it's Ruh. So because it's Ruh, which is breath, spirit, Ruach correspondingly in Hebrew, that there is a relationship to Jibrīl that is different than all other permutations of the 99 names, because the breath must be transmitted. And that Jibrīl's relationship to Mary that really was impregnating her with Ruh. And that Jibrīl takes on more of a paternal role than any other involvement with any other prophet that doesn't have Ruh as their corresponding name. And because of this, Jesus is able to use Ruh in his lifetime to animate the clay bird and to perform miracles that look out of the ordinary, considering the actions of other prophets. Because the miraculous is not supposed to happen in that way, right? It is Allah that performs miracles, maybe at the behest of prophets, but it's not a one prophet that's doing magic tricks. But Jesus is distinctly different in the Quran. So this part of this is the relationship to Jibrīl and to Ruh, and the tie between those two with Maryam. And because one of the things is that Mary gives birth in silence in the Quran, and she's shamed, right? She comes back from the desert, and Jesus explains to the town, I think, or even her parents, that he is the child of God. Like, she doesn't do the explaining, but Jesus is born with the ability to speak truth. Like, he's speaking from baby. So the hadith traditions around Jesus and Mary and Ruh and Jibrīl are another source of wonder and tingly places for me. Past the screwed up calendrics of moving all these quote unquote lesser angels around. But there's also the tending, when we talk of Gabriel, as far as in like rabbinic Judaism, he's the left hand of God, which is fascinating, right? So the side that's closest to the heart, but never necessarily within a Semitic culture, the good hand, let's say, but that and Michael being the right hand, that in certain Kabbalistic ascription, right, and we see this in Lurianic Kabbalah that becomes the basis of a lot of modern occultism, that Yesod is the sphere of Gabriel, and therefore plays into why the messenger is the angel that we might encounter the most, or that humans have more interaction with directly, because the moon, being the closest body, filters the light of all other spheres down in a way that we can interpret and interact with. And that speaking to fixed star magic, of that even the most distant, the eighth heavens, the eighth sphere can actually be mitigated solely by the moon, and almost bypassing all of the other steps up the ladders, just because of this, which speaks to the relationship, of course, between the messenger and the moon there. And also that with the connection to the garden, that Jibrīl is the one that is responsible for bringing new souls into the world, right? The tree of souls, I can't remember its name, but the new souls that are falling from the tree of life go into the treasury of souls, and Gabriel takes the soul out of the treasury, and Layla, the angel of conception, watches over the embryo until it's born. So Layla also meaning night, right? So conception is, and probably important to say, gestation, what grows in the night. So there's still this corresponding relationship with darkness, with night, with everything going on there. But this Talmudic angel of Layla is there.
The one who comes at night is this is a way of referring to Tariq, or the road, which is also the name for the geomantic figure known as Via in Latin, and also a surah in the Quran itself. It is, we've been talking about geomancy a little bit already, but it is interesting to think about the way that the night comer, the one who's arrives in darkness, this kind of primordial point or embryonic point, that we've been talking about, and then the mirror, of course, which the Arabic figure of Jum'ah would be populous in the Latin, is a mirror-like figure, even in the way that it interacts with the other figures. It reproduces the figure that it interacts with as if a mirror. And so populous and via interacting in this way, and to, of course, I love how just cohesive all the topics were with this one. Ibn Arabi, one of the main parts of his doctrines being that humanity is also the mirror of God. And so the populace or the people, or Jumu'ah, which is like the gathering, specifically the Friday gathering at the mosque, is the people, right? The mass of people. And this mass of people is the reflection of, or the great mirror of God. And this is also something this is how we refer to the moon, as well, as being mirror-like or water-like. And for the, this kind of magic you're referencing, whether it's stars or the lunar mansion, it's the mirror-like quality of the moon, which allows this to happen, allows for the efficacy of the magic, unlike trying to get trying to make a talisman with a conjunction from Venus or Mars, let's say, in a star, where these planetary bodies already have a very distinct personality, but there's something about the moon being like the figure of populace, which is mirror-like, so allows a reflection to occur with less and less interference. And of course, this is something that comes up again and again in the Sufi tradition of cleaning the mirror, so as a human being, as a mirror of God, we may better reflect the light of God. So it's a cleaner reflection, if you will. But I love the way that the geomantic figures interact with everything that we've been talking about. Maybe it'd be cool to talk a little bit more about populace.
Yeah, absolutely.
A couple of things just to stir it on there is you're reminding me of the whichever verse it is, but there's two mentions of, ironically, of God creating everything in pairs in the Quran. And this notion is sometimes described solely as male and female, but is also the basis for the heavenly double that Arabi is going to go hugely into, right? And that if there is this world of form, that there must be a world of ideas, following on the Platonic impulse there, and whole worlds of creation in the other world. But that part of this, apropos of current writings, the mistranslation of the Hermetic maxim and its earliest Arabic attestations, and even into Latin correctly at first, of that which is above is from that which is below, and that which is below is from that which is above, as opposed to the latter Latin translation of that which is below is like unto that which is above.
Right.
And so we have broken the relationship where it is actually part and intertangled and paired with the two, that everything that is connected in this entangled web of pairing, that an interdependence, that via by its nature must be populous as well, and populous by its nature must be via, and both can be lunar, then the call to prayer and then the coming together for prayer. And that when we make it like and make it symbol and make it simile, that we have actually destroyed something essential about that nature, which is the start of a shift in many ways towards that wonderful death of miracle and the Protestant Reformation and eventually atheistic materialism that is we're still trying to survive. And that is all, probably as well. The transition from via to populace, and taking its, again, Odu's a tricky thing because I want to quote what's public and not be too interpretive and things like that. But when you combine Odu and you get, when you're going from via, it's equivalent of being Ogbe or Ogbe Meji, going to Oyeku Meji, that they eventually those pair, right? So the one that starts with Ogbe and ends with Oyekun, which would be equivalent to via modified by populace, right? Mm-hmm. That the story contained in that is that of the forgotten altar, and that there is a king whose village is not prospering, and he goes for a reading, And essentially, he's told that there's an altar in his palace that has been neglected, and that he must spend the rest of his life searching for it. And that he will, as a king, he is now tasked with every day he will be serving a different altar, and to understand that he will never be finished, that he will start tending to his altars on Sunday morning and finish on Saturday night. And that this is partially what it is to be a good ruler. It's partially what it is to have dropped this sign, where it's the father of combinations, because these are the two oldest signs in the standard order of Ifa, of being Ogbe followed by Oyeku. So there is similarly, I do like preferences where Via and Populus are listed first. They are not always listed first, of course, but that kind of overlap with, I'm not going to propose the universal. I'm going to propose that I'm lazy and don't like memorizing different orders. And it's completely self-serving. But Populus I feel gets a really freaking bad rap a lot of the time, right? Like, it just as the emblematic darkness, the dark mirror, the crowd that corrupts the meaning of the individual, the thing that Western mind fears more than most, of like the status quo, and trying to keep up with the Kardashians at the same time.
I think all that's present in at least early modern European takes on Populus, for sure. Or celebrity. There is a certain amount of people power. There's a lot of like demagoguery of like stirring up the crowd to war or to like hate a particular bunch of people. There's some good people power stuff. There's also plenty of like, people are the worst. I think it's worth pointing out that in going through the placements, the delineations of how the figures speak in the various houses, that the crowd doesn't vote unanimously, and the placements of Populus are filled with conflicting accounts from early modern geomancers of like literally, Populus in the sixth, by some reckonings meaning that the illness will be small and pissy, and some being like, oh no, he's on his way out, and it can be a particularly difficult one to read in some circumstances, as it's like this faint voice fades into the background murmur. But I think when you got an eye for nuance and the specificities of the case, the crowd does begin to answer more clearly. But it's also absolutely tied to water, phlegmatism, the dark. All these are bad things that those perennial European ideas of the strong leader, the strong masculine leader will like triumph over in various ways. It can signify like having to feed everyone, of having way too many options, as well as like not really having any, like the kind of the two halves of it. Like, you can find it in the clamor of a busy street, but it's also there in like the flattened grass where like a marquee or a big top was up and everyone was, dancing and having a lovely time and then went away. Like there's a strong presence of absence with Populus, I think, with the presence of expectation and potentiality.
How does that tie into Fortuna Minor?
Fortuna Minor it feels more like it tries to take the path of least resistance in its devil may care surfing of Lady Fortuna's fickle fortunes, right? It cautions that things will be up and down. There will be crunchy and there will be smooth. Whereas a Populus is a lot more like you get out what you bring in. And even then, it will probably be dissipated a little bit.
Okay, because where I was going with that was when you're describing the dancing and things like that. I think of fairy court,
Mm.
like the gold that becomes coal by morning.
Right.
And is that Fortuna Minor? Is that Populus? Is it just shitty luck?
Oh yeah. Fortuna Minor is absolutely the gold that isn't the next day. Yeah. Finding $100 in the street and then going home to $100 parking ticket. Yeah. That's very Fortuna Minor for me, at least.
But the memory of the ball itself is still perhaps Populus.
Yeah. I mean, the gathering and certainly the empty plaza in the city, thrumming with like all of the ghosts of the marketplace and things like that is that like that kind of clockwork ghost town thrumming on a constant cycle of midnight,
It's funny you brought up Fortuna Minor, actually, because just yesterday I was rereading Ibn Arabi in his Meccan Revelations, writing about the jinn. and he tends to take a pretty elemental focus. And in
Mm.
Arabic geomancy, there is this strong elemental focus in the figures, kind of in the order we're typically used to: fire at the top and earth at the bottom. But Fortuna Minor being the figure with the two top dots concentrated in fire and air, and this being the elemental makeup, the primary elemental makeup of the jinn, according to Ibn Arabi. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh, that's like Fortuna Minor, and human beings being more like Fortuna Major, wherein there's this focus on the earth and water portion in the elemental makeup of the figure, and more of a dispersal.
The clay and the humors. Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow, because then that really ties into Iblis, right? the being born jinn but being raised to the rank of angel, and therefore the reason that Iblis can defy God. And this is in that mythic telling of God creating man and then telling Iblis and the other angels to bow before his creation, and Iblis saying unabashedly, I serve no one but you. Which points out the error in Allah's, which is impossible, of course, but it points out the error in Allah's perhaps test, and therefore Iblis is now relegated to a different position. But that Iblis is born jinn because the jinn were created 10,000 years, I think Arabi says 10,000 years before mankind. So they have a whole masterful civilization in the unseen world.
In that same chapter, I'm recalling because it's just so fresh in my mind. In that same chapter, he has a really interesting and unique take, which is that, or perhaps it's something that others have thought about but maybe not committed to writing, which is just a broader definition of jinn based on the letters and the etymology, I guess, of the word. Jinn essentially just referring to hidden, but he takes this broader definition, hidden being also the human interiority, or what would be referred to as the batin, as opposed to the zahir, or the esoteric as opposed to the exoteric. And in what's really fascinating and relevant to this is that Ibn Arabi also says, well, you could think of angels as jinn as well, in the sense that angels belong to the unseen world, and all beings that belong to the unseen world, including human interiority, meaning the things we would think of as the mind, imagination, so on and so forth, can be referred to as jinn, which is a really wonderful way of going around this very long theological debate about whether Iblis is a jinn or an angel, which is not something that has ever been unanimously agreed upon, and various authors and hadiths have completely disagreed on it. So I was just reading that in that same chapter, and I was like, oh, it's so simple, but it's such a great take.
It's not a million miles away in terms of how it's being referenced to the idea of, like, yes, demons may or may not have effect in the world, are probably not physical in the same way that humans are, but also they can exist in and from the mind. And that's not to psychologize, but to point out that both have an influence on the other as we are mirroring God.
Exactly. He doesn't deny the lived reality of these spiritual beings, but is also inclusive of the psychological reality, as you said.
So we have, on the one hand, these two origins for Iblis. We have the almost the Fortuna Major of the hard work of a jinn who was created a very long time ago, and like works his way up with all that like good hard won success, and then the idea of a senior angel who and then falls, as opposed to a fallen a senior angel, Azazel, right? Who's not Azazel, who is tasked with wiping out disobedient jinn who precede mankind. And then falls, or rather, like is cast out of his angelic role. Yeah, these matters of free will do seem to be pertinent to these discussions, right? Like, as well as theodicy, right? Like, what's the existence of evil? Is Iblis like indeed the father of devils, right? Or is he simply the guy doing God's particularly dirty jobs?
It's a whole complicated exegesis. And it has gotten, maybe not this in particular, but this kind of thinking that I'm about to reference has gotten quite a few people burned at the stake. I mean, it's in the Sufi tradition. Beyond, I guess I should start with the basics, which is Iblis is this figure who is often likened to Satan, but isn't really Satan, who is oftentimes likened to Lucifer. As I mentioned earlier in the show, there's similarities with Samael, and as you mentioned, Azazel as well. I think you guys did an episode on Azazel, right? Yeah. So there's definitely a lot of similarities, even Azazel being explicitly Iblis's name before the fall. This is in the Islamic tradition explicitly. So he, as this figure, he's garnered all sorts of names, which I think are particularly telling. Abu al-Harith, which is like, translates something to father of the plowmen, because there's this idea that he's in constant grief, or he's in constant toil. So the father of this is my interpretation, or father of the plowmen, the father of those who are in constant toil, if you will, as well as Abu Mura, which is like the father of bitterness. So similar to constant toil, just like the father of all of those who are constantly embittered, grieving, or in a melancholic state. And in this way, sort of known to wear the cloak of darkness, or the black cloak, or the black turban, as well as oftentimes in miniature painting, especially in the Persianate world, being depicted with very, very dark skin, like gray skin. My favorites are the ones that actually he looks like a little gray alien almost, which is its own fun thing to muse on for me. But so he's this figure, and he's also referred to as one-eyed, interestingly enough. And I think this is sort of to reference his myopic vision, in that he cannot, as much as humanity is the reflection of God, and Iblis, as he is most known, in not bowing down to humanity after God creates humanity, can only see God from this one eye, without being able to see God's reflection in human beings with the other eye. There's so many exegetical interpretations, the most heretical being this notion of Iblis being the greatest monotheist, if you will. This is found in Halaj, this is found in Ahmed Ghazali, probably perhaps the most heretical in a Persianate Sufi known as Ain al-Qudat, who has this really beautiful, but also, of course, controversial notion of the Shahada, the La ilaha illallah, the La ilaha portion being this negative place wherein Muslims may remain if they cannot move to the next level, which is essentially guarded by Iblis, who in refusing to bow down to Adam shows his great devotion to God in this refusal to bow. And in full devotion to complete the Shahada in its fullest form, La ilaha illallah, the final portion, there is no other God but God. To reach this final inner circle, one must pass through Iblis, who is considered to be the greatest devotee of God in his refusal to bow down. This is, I mean, as I'm sure most people will sort of pick up on, a pretty heretical take. But it is a take, a mystical take in the Sufi tradition nonetheless, and I find it to be a particularly fascinating one.
You've got to be pretty devoted to do all that horrible stuff for God.
Well, does he have a choice at a certain point because of the silence, right? Can he complain? Is that whole there's lore about that? He cannot even complain nor praise God. That is all internal. That the silence is what is the punishment. To be the silent one is there. But the kind of heretical, there's so much Idris Shah, right? And the kindling that was for a complete fascination with Sufism that has fueled a lot of traditional craft through Chumley's fascination and involvement, and then moving through that, because the maxim, right, after passing through the eye that is the mouth of Iblis to be able to profess and change La ilaha illallah to La ilaha illallah, that there is no God but I, and to have this not be heretical, but to understand the mystic union of that if there is a separation from God, that where there is a perceiver, then there is no union. And this statement itself is like, if you're going to say Anal Haq and proclaim that you are the truth, what are you going to do? We, is it we? Is it just is it the pronoun that's that? Like, how do we get around that and the hubris side of that? Because do you become Iblis if you fail to pass through the eye? Do you join this? And human beings are nothing as far as silent. That's not our talent. But while you're speaking of the notions here of populace and never really thinking about the tarikat as referencing geometric figures of in darkness the path, that there's this kind of thing with this 2222 and 1111, that these are the mothers, right, or progenitors of all other signs.
Yes.
And this is why the reference sign before of Oyeku of being the father of combinations. It is the 17th in the list of 256 because it is the first combination of light and darkness. And if we're taking that Sufic maxim of in darkness the path, of you're talking about the world before creation of darkness, and then light issues forth in that singular ray that is the first letter of and last letter of Ikra, that provides counsel, that provides a direction, but you still need the contrast of the world before things are spoken into place in order to allow for other things. And whatever the order is of the figures, or whether it's in Ifa or in the various permutations and schools of thought, especially within the Muslim side, emphasizes order of the figures a lot more than perhaps the European inheritance of geomancy. But that there is this understanding of the interaction of these parts of the figures themselves, of what is it to expand out, contract, or like where you have this marriage of Karker and conjunctio, these are essential opposites, or the flipping of things and mirror images between Kara and Kappa Draconis and things like this. This is a dance and an act of creation that is balanced on the point of the lightning flash that is contained within the darkness. Populace that gives birth, this is the some I've seen and you kind of brought it up already, but the almost a Tiamat Marduk like relationship in all the troublesome things that brings up. Yes. But this is the voice across the waters. And
exactly, that's what I was thinking. The darkness across the moving across the face of the void, and the weight of water. Right. If we can compare populace to the other typically or sometimes untypically water signs, water figures, right? If Thea is this flowing waters of change and the riptide, as well as the meandering of the river, and Rubius is the stagnant swamps of pestilence, and Laetitia, I read Laetitia as a watery figure, as these bubbling brooks and fountaining delights, and that's absolutely a figure of of fairy dances, especially in meadows. But I think then in that case, we can know populace in and as like the vast depths of oceans, in the deep end, in the weight of water, especially in the weight of ice, or of like the oceanic, but also like the bathic, the deep, the sediment, the thing that was there before that light worked on or worked through or came out of. And that sense of like sediment, or like the deepest depths of the ocean and things like that. Also, I was thinking about, I came across an epithet or a nickname of Iblis as Abu Kardus, which may mean the father who piles up, who crams, or who crowds together. And this like darkness that comes when we just like mash stuff on top of each other, or just let things pile up.
Yeah, love that name. That's also something we associate with the moon often. The moon, which gathers things together, which accumulates in this way.
I like the moon, the relationship between the moon and the prophet, and the cycles of things. We're going to talk about the thing that piles up, right? The moon is piling light and then piling darkness upon itself. But that the numerology wise, that the prophet is associated with the number 14, which yes is the bones in the hand, but is also the moon cycle of going to the full moon, the fullest of light. And, of course, the full light of the moon versus the darkness of the moon gives an exact reason as to why it can be both via and populous, without any mystery, perhaps, of like why other figures might be associated with other planets. But you get unanimously like,
yeah. I think of something. I don't know if I'm tangenting a little bit, but I also think there's something.
Us tangent, never.
Imagine. It's something of the the cyclopean in like the strictest sense of like, I wonder if all unimaginably huge things have something of populace to them, like the not just the majesty of night, but it's just like incalculable vastness, right? Especially when seen both close up and distant enough to like gawp at your own dawning awareness that you're like failing to fully comprehend its vastness in the first place. Like the dark isn't just dark, but like the darkness is like huger than everything else.
It's interesting. You bring me back then to Layla and the womb of night that is an angelic force within Judaism, and then specifically being noted that Layla is one of the few angels that has feminine characteristics. So in modern Christian expression, you often see Gabriel depicted as female, or at least ambivalent, which is funny because, that's the same community that doesn't particularly care for pronouns. But there's a lot of gender fluidity in Gabriel and many angels because they have no gender. But that Layla, as a nurturing force, the gestation of the womb that is likened to the world resting at night to give sway to what has to happen the next day. And that Layla is the opposite of Lilith. So the thing that the one that preserves seed and allows for growth, whether it's in the ground or in humans, is directly opposed to that which wastes seed. And that's a fact that there's a lot there.
Yeah, both Jade and various things called lilies also have a bunch of like seed and sperm mysteries specifically to them when we get to those. Interested in pinging that.
Yeah, definitely. I love the seed and sperm mysteries.
It's all right. Well, let's keep bouncing then. So going through what we mean by lily, right? In the course of our herb sections are often about like also traipsing through all the weeds of things that get called that thing, but might not be what we're on about. So there's a 17th century anonymous English herbal I was going through from 1690, which lists there are three sorts of lily: lily of the valley, water lily, and white lily. This is the lily of the valley is under Mercury, the other two are under the moon. And the major things are that it's there's a bunch of things, but a lot of cooling heat. So when Gerard is speaking of the white lily of Constantinople, which is the English name for it, he specifically mentions that the flower is steeped in oil olive. it's nice, oil olive, and then stirred up a little bit and left in the sun in a strong glass is good to soften the hardness of sinews and the hardness of the matrix. So we have this notion of like an overly hard womb, and then later on there's also a bunch of stuff about effectual to stay fluxes of blood or humors of the wounds, to effectually cool and bind all and restrain all fluxes, as also the running of the veins, venery, and the passage away of the seed when one is asleep. So it's specifically, again, these big lunar mysteries, specifically about nocturnal emissions and avoiding them.
I've got this really, really mundane take because working as a florist, I've always associated lilies with people's allergies and complaints more than anything else. Like the lily is the flower that nobody wants in their hotel, in their space, because they can always smell it and because it causes more allergic reactions from a distance. In particular, more than any other flower, which like I'm going to tie back to in my mind, the mysteries of Isa, as we've talked about, and the ruach, and the breath and the wind, and the impregnating breath, or the impregnating wind of Jibrīl, is like the lily can infect people with allergies and sneezing fits and intensely strong visceral sense from a distance. I mean, it really has an incredible ability to be able to do that.
Oh yeah, it'll kill cats. That pollen,
just the pollen alone. Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny. I, who am allergic to everything, if it's in the air, right? Find lilies wonderfully helpful because they live so long once they are cut, right? It's 2 weeks and they're still good and smell good. One of my favorite things with a lily is just that it's the plant of like fuck you, from in that way too, but of Venus or Aphrodite, of Hera being tricked by Zeus to breastfeed a baby that was not her own and partake more of divinity in this way, because it was, a demigod that he was trying to make her make a little bit more less demi, more god. Less demi, more god. Wow. So and then the baby was at her breast, and Hercules, of course, nurses, and Hera wakes up and is like, what the fuck, and flings the baby, but some of her milk goes on the grounds, gusts across the heaven and makes the Milky Way. And then the ones that fall to the earth become the first lilies. So there is an inherent connection between the Milky Way and lilies, which then ties into the whole concept of fleur-de-lis, pilgrimage, Compostela, fixed stars, gets my brain going. Yeah. Then also, because the lily is so pretty that the goddess of beauty herself is like, this is that bitch, and flicks her fingers, and the stamen, the pistil, comes out of the lily to be like, I stain your whiteness with my red. And like this like pure desire, the mist that we can talk about of people being like of the white becoming pink, let's say, of like just out of desire of this red dust that now, and it, there's this reddening is there.
That's another really good mundane take. Yeah, I mean, the way that the pollen just stains clothing like no other, especially if you're working with it directly. But lilies have that projectile quality about them.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of I know that it's a very sacred flower depicted in Cretan art, which I find just the whole Minoan thing too, because there's also a lot of controversy now about what is unified culture of that group, because we've only been looking at evidence for 100 years of Cretan civilization, because before that the term Cretan had a reason as to why it was used, but also associated with Judaism very specifically, and then eventually with Christianity, as a symbol of chastity and virtue, associated with Virgin Mary. And then you also get this strange thing of it's still referencing that chastity of like Aphrodite and Hera flicking off on this figure, that I find that fascinating. But the lily is associated with martyrdom, and especially virgin martyrs. So those who are not stained by the semenical I'm making up words. Oh, they never had sex. And that hopefully they don't even have stains upon their lily whiteness, but and also symbol very heavily associated with marriage and chastity and the sanctity of the generative force within the couple, and especially tied to Saint Anthony of Padua. So Tony come around.
And resurrection with the Easter lily, no?
Yes. Yeah, but the Easter lily is a Japanese flower that's only 20th century, I believe.
There's so many things called lilies that aren't really lilies.
Yeah.
Let's not even getting into water lilies.
Yeah.
Or calla lilies.
Yeah, calla lilies. What's up with calla lilies?
That's the funeral flower for sure.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of Audrey in
Little Shop
Horrors, where it's the glitter and the oh god. Anyway,
Audrey, not Audrey 2.
Yeah, not Audrey 2. The actual.
Sorry, doctor.
That Audrey. So Lily as well in its permutations. By the time we get to Kimbanda, it is the symbol par excellence of the kingdom of the souls. It is so tied to the kingdom of souls in the way that the rose is tied to the kingdom of the crossroads, and that there's something chaste and pure about this, and the kind of condescension and like critical distance that the kingdom of souls, that those spirits represent, and of course across the board, the kingdom of souls is a notion that's not just from Kimbanda. It's in Umbanda. It's in many of the various spiritist faiths, that these are everything from the pretos verios to the more severe cachizos that are like teachers that are like, be disciplined, you need to be disciplined, and the lily is tied up in this concept of hard work, discipline, listen to the advice of your elders, fall upon tradition, and don't get caught up in the flashiness of things. And it's like, don't get caught. The lily is an incredibly flashy flower. It just happens to be white. It sure blots out the smell of roses if there's an equal amount of roses and lilies in the room. But also comes to mind is consider the lilies of the field, right? How they grow, toil not, neither do they spin. Even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these.
Which makes me think of the Douglas Adams thing about like humans assumed that dolphins weren't smart because they just spent all their time dicking about in the water, and dolphins thought exactly the same about humans. But they were smart because they didn't do that.
And there's something with Lily too. As far as Lily of the Valley and its ascription within modern craft circles to being sacred to Lilith, who we've already mentioned, and as the kind of poisonous brood mother of the Sangreal, as we would say, in this kind of heretical Gnostic interpretatio Gnostica.
Yeah, just thinking about all of it, the ways it is the white one, or like even framing things as lily white, which is, you know, a little bit Shakespearean, but is also directly humoral, right? We're talking about the pale phlegmatism of like the slightly salty seawater haunt of fear, like the in all of its like the fleshiness of its like flowers and the whiteness in the dark. Girard quotes, speaking of its links to the line of the souls. Girard quotes Saint Basil in the explication of the 44th Psalm, saithing that no flower so lively sets forth the frailty of man's life as the lily, which I thought was an interesting one to throw in there.
I like that. Sometimes they smell like corpses.
In the lovely way that, you know, corpses can smell like lilies. I just the memory of the confused. This was is generally a harder card. Having studied Lenormand cards and having tried to help others learn it, Lily is a difficult card, and it's a very paradoxical card, and part of that is because of the contrast between the German school and the French school of interpretation, which by the time we get to America, you have to incorporate both. But sensuality, sex, virtue, morality, ethics, and wisdom. You can see the overlap there with like Kimbanda and Umbanda ascriptions to the lily there, right?
Uprightness.
Yeah, it has the full Madonna whore parallels that happen in the cards. So it's a perfect example of and we've talked about this before with Lenormand, and I think Lenormand then is an excellent example of perhaps Populus and Via's inextricably boundness, is that you can't just pull one card for Lenormand. You need at least a pair, ideally a line of 3 or 5, a grid of 9, or a whole grand tableau, because it has to be read in context and positionality to the other cards to form a sentence. Lenormand is going to be, is this the noun, the adjective, the verb? What are we looking at in this sentence that is being told to us in a very blunt way? Right. So the etherealness of the lily, the mercy, the justice is there, the purity of heart is there, but also all the things that are sensual, all the things we associate with that touching of the redness of it, the smell, the fact that you can taste lilies, right? Like you taste them. It's really difficult. You never put it in a restaurant because it's just it has that side with it. I also one of my passions of rabbit hole study, I guess, in the past year has been looking at classic spiritist texts, especially like biographies and pseudo-biographies, autobiographies, and the ones in Shadowland, specifically of Elizabeth d'Espérance, which was Elizabeth Hope is her nom de plume. But she was a materializing medium, and she was very good at materializing fruit and flowers.
Wow.
And this is not something talked about very commonly because usually Spiritism is still tied up in its history of fraudulent manifestations of things. But yes, there are photos, and there's these weird, that spirit photography trend that happens. We're like, this is multiple exposure. But she was famous for conjuring certain plants, especially lilies. And if you look in Shadowland, she talks specifically about her guide Yolande, which I have an affinity because that's my mother's name. But Walter and Yolande are two of her spirit guides that seem to be helpful at manifesting flowers. So you have Walter Tracy, who's a 22-year-old Yale student who drowned, and Yolande is a young Arab girl. And they can manifest different things, including the Ixora crocata and the golden lily. So these flowers that she would manifest during these seances would then live for 2 days, 4 days, 2 weeks, and then crumble into nothingness. They would crumble into light or a pile of ash. But the golden lily itself is something that is it's a big topic in Shadowland. It's a whole chapter devoted to it. But and including looking at the golden lily and these photographs of like, look how exceptional this is, and like the Ixora crocata plant, which is I think it's in Manchester that happens, and this is 1880s, but 150 little flowers produced, which looks almost like a jasmine plant or that type of thing. But everything of like being very, very meticulous to counting all of the leaves, describing everything in extremely strong detail. And so it's interesting. So materialism mediums, totally interesting thing. People producing fruits and flowers. I have a list of such studies, and I love it. But the golden lily was Yolande's last work. That's the last thing she did for her, and moved on. But there's
magnum opus.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like a 6 foot tall lily that comes in that looks as if it's made of gold. And yeah, there's a lovely photograph of it in there. So, and I think it was live a week which certain photographs were taken during that time period, and then it dissolved and disappeared.
That's super awesome. The making of flowering plants and fruits like come forth is some of the stuff that I've been most interested in, especially making trees appear in the magic rings of the Lunar Mansions I've been looking at in prep for this chat, and just in general of late, going through a bunch of working books of cunning folk and finding a lot of these formula for the rings that are made in particular ways and that generally do kind of illusion looking things, and there are several for bringing forth or making it appear that trees are heavy with fruit, or that there are there's a gathering of birds singing, and by extension birds that you could catch and eat, as well as making meadows spring up and forests spring up. Got really interested in that, and it's fascinating to see that that's something that spiritists are doing as well, in maybe a very different form, which
is so much cooler and frankly more productive than so many of the things ascribed to the Lunar Mansions and like the Picatrix, the Hayat al-Hakim, about destroying cities and like more Lunar Mansions for destroying more cities. Let's get some flowers and fruits and trees, even if it is an illusion. I would rather have that than destroying more cities. Castles in the air, not in ruins. Yeah. No, I got time for that. So what do you see the Picatrix as being particularly influential in wider Lunar Mansion work, like from medieval period onwards, Jay? I think it's probably the most influential, at least in the quote unquote West. With the book I mentioned earlier, the Shams al-Ma'arif, this book tends to be more popular in the strictly Arabic speaking world, Islamic world, as it is filled with references to the Quran and is just based more in that religion. But when it comes to Western magic, going through Agrippa, as well as to Christopher Warnock and more contemporary iterations of this kind of magic with the Lunar Mansions or with the fixed stars. I mean, the Picatrix is like the text. which my peers and friends Elodie and Chris over at the Lunar Zodiac Project, I mean, they for as long as I've known them, they're like, yeah, the Picatrix has a lot of things in it just meant for warlords, it seems. Which is, I mean, it's a good observation. And for the most part, it's true. It exists in a very particular historical context. And as we know about magic, magic has been used by people in positions of authority and people with wealth to, as one other layer of having a military or finances as weaponry. Magic being one more thing that they may use in their arsenal. And the people who had the funds, the dough to be able to produce these kinds of manuscripts and texts, these were oftentimes their desires or the things that were a priority for them. So it's interesting to see the way that people who do not exist in that context interact with those same magics.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Oh, bro, cultists.
Destroying cities, bro.
Yeah.
I mean, the Lunar Mansions have such a martial quality in that paradigm, but I think by and large, more and more I tend to, and this is less from a magical perspective, but more from like understanding them in natal astrology and mundane astrology, and just from like a esoteric perspective, lean more on the Indian material, the Vedic material of the nakshatras, which so much of the Arabic lunar mansion lore and symbolism really does come from the Indian. And many of the images that you might carve into a talisman from the Picatrix, these being images that go back to some of the really, really ancient Vedic stories or stories from the Vedas that inform the nakshatras or the lunar mansions. So I tend to look there for, I don't want to say a healthier perspective, but maybe a more well-rounded perspective on the lunar mansions. I mean, as they exist in the Arabic lore, you're talking about a strong mixture with things that came from India, as well as Bedouin or star lore, essentially, mixing with some of these more mystical concepts from Islam that we've been talking about, the letters and the numbers and their association with the phases of the moon, this kind of thing.
For me, the Lunar Mansions, my first introduction to them was through Ibn Arabi. The Picatrix was not like, there was no really good English translation available. It was a mythic tome, right? That there was one edition that was famously translated by someone who didn't understand astrology, and so there's a lot of strangeness about the elections given in that particular book. But that was a worthy undertaking that then allowed other people to set up for better English translations. I remember the lists, the astrological lists, classical, medieval, Renaissance astrology lists, where people would argue about whether the Picatrix was even valid to Western astrology. And it was a classic thing of like, well, I've never needed it and I don't know anything about it, so obviously it can't be that important. Then it was, it's the people running the list like Warnock and others that were like, this is like one of the most important texts. And just because we don't understand it well, or if you read Latin, you have an option to understand how existingly perfect that text is, or how it informs Western astrological image magic in a way that nothing else informs it quite as much. And I don't know, I'm coming through the division of parts of the soul and projection across the sky and the journey towards the hidden cities in the imaginal realm through an Ibn Arabi like deep dive after trying to understand what Corbin was talking about and things like this. And Arabi himself is apparently as is perhaps just part and parcel of a lot of Arabic things. Jay, you are responsible for a translation that it was not available in any accessible way, and this notion of like Ibn Arabi, I remember by in like 2003, 2004, I think I'd read everything you could get in English on Ibn Arabi. And then I went into Spanish and like trying to read everything I could in Spanish. And now there's so much more. Yeah, I doubt I'll ever be able to read everything he ever wrote, just because the man was so prolific.
Ibn Arabi's take on the lunar mansions for most largely comes from Titus Burckhart's mystical astrology of Ibn Arabi, I believe it's called, which I'm actually not sure of the original source text. So if you're aware of them, it'd be good to bring it up. But in trying to go deeper into different texts that Ibn Arabi talks about the lunar stations and the stars, I mean, I understand why this is the reference that people make when it comes to Ibn Arabi, because so much of the rest of it is extremely esoteric and dense, especially if you don't have the Arabic background to get into it, because he's relating these different stations to very particular theological references and prophets and this sort of thing, and it's stations on the path to essentially this perfection of oneself, or as I referenced earlier, the insan al-kamil, or this notion of the perfect person. And the text that most people are working with, this mystical astrology, does have a different letter correspondence per the lunar mansions, which I think is a good thing. Because in once again, quote unquote, Western magic, we tend to, and people have messaged me in the process of publishing the book of like, well, you know, what are the geomantic correspondences around the lunar mansions, and you know, how does this relate to the letter correspondences? And I mean, fundamentally, there is no one set of correspondence, and it seems like sort of an obvious thing, or should be an obvious thing, but in many respects, it really isn't. And the Ibn Arabi list does have a few crossovers with the one from the Shams al-Ma'arif, for example, which goes in the more traditional Abjad sequence of the Arabic alphabet, and the Ibn Arabi list kind of moves around a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's important that he essentially comes up with his own system, which, I mean, just like lists of geomantic figures, as we're seeing more and more, it's not anything that's static by any means. Right. And that a mystic, someone as brilliant as Ibn Arabi, can approach the lunar stations and have each letter reveal themselves to him, and these kinds of correspondences come along, and I mean, almost what we would call like UPG in some sense.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, working out for himself.
Basically, what it is.
Yeah.
But then what the beauty of that then is that, right, then that can be contextualized to his students. And that is, you know, if we're taking, it goes back to arguments of letter versus spirit of the law and things like this, of like, sure, you can memorize this proposed universalism, but do you understand why it was in that order to begin with? Whereas someone who changes the order can be like, no, I can tell you why I changed it. Right. And this is in talking, had many conversations with Katarina, who's been on the show as well. You both know her well, of the exceptions when collecting folklore are what prove folklore. If something, and this, you see this and following kind of like the semiotic and linguistic nod there, that the more simple a language is, it's more refined, it's more edited. Ancient languages are incredibly complex. Ancient stories are incredibly complex. And we see that even in the discussions around things like Cornish folklore, right? That like there's no one city that does all the things that are in Cornish folklore books. Right. This city does May Day, this city does Halloween, and this city over here does something around spring. And they are all Cornish, but they all, you know, they're not going to argue like, no, we do what we do in this city. And similarly, lineages of thought are no different. That it's with this concept we've talked about before, but very prevalent in Gimanda nossa magia, right? Like our magic, our way of doing things. Stick to what you know, stick to what has been handed to you, work with that. Don't worry about trying to prove a universal. Right.
The biodiversity of the folk repertoire, of like folk practice, not just like abstract things that we like law or like ideas, but like things people do. That biodiversity resists the archiving of the one true list, right? And shows signs of a thriving like engagement with the practice,
which is so Ibn Arabi as well. I mean, more than any other thinker in the Islamic mystical milieu, and so much. I mean, you mentioned Corban earlier. So much why Corban was so inspired by Ibn Arabi is this same notion that every individual has this mediatrix, which is sort of the Lord, which is related to a divine name of God, which we say there's 99 divine names, but really there's an infinite amount of names of God and divisions in this pluralism. And Ibn Arabi really is like, no, every individual has this unique face or wajh of God, this unique manifestation in which they might interact with the divine. There is no single path in this way, which is and this mediatrix being what oftentimes gets called the imaginal, which we hear on and on about, but really this is this in between that is unique for every person, meaning that it's going to look different for everybody. There isn't this singularity.
No, and even in the texts themselves, they're not singular. Learning that the Meccan revelations or the Meccan illuminations, as it gets translated sometimes, the more popularly circulated one, at least like just at his death, was the second draft he'd been working on for 2 years before he passed away, and that this is the one that was like kind of unfinished in some ways, or at least it was unfinished edits of a second edition of a finished first edition. And I can't remember who it was. I was reading an essay on this that was arguing that like this is one of the other ways that these texts are still living, that like we don't have full translations of all of these texts into English. Not that should be any kind of like marker of whether or not it's proper, but quite the reverse, that like that there are so many people using different parts of it in different ways that to speak of a definitive full translation of, I don't know, of the Meccan revelations or of the Shums or whatever, like is demonstrating a lack of awareness of the broader and complicated context of like there are lots of kind of not versions but like iterations, shall we say.
His body of work mirrors it exactly in that way. His prolific body of work, as I was speaking about with Jesse just the other day. People being I
feel like it's still a pen that he programmed somewhere that is still writing.
Well, yeah, I mean, you also have to bear in mind that like a book might be like a scroll, right? I think about that when I look at like historical figures that have written thousands of books, and I'm like still trying to gnaw my way through finishing another one.
He definitely has shorter passages, but there's some books that are hundreds of pages, and there's hundreds of those, and you're like, what is happening? He figured out how to harness his heavenly double, bring him to earth, and make him right with him.
So William C. Chittick in his book on Ibn Arabi, the heir to the prophets, claims of the 850 works attributed to him that 700 are authentic and over 400 are actually still extant, and that you can like find a version of.
This is the kalam. This is the aleph, the pen that never stops writing in the book of nature. And when you become the perfected man, you partake of this, and it never really does end.
Yeah. Which this is, and I think the importance here to speak of it within the cultural context of a tradition which eschews the graphic and embraces solely the written word as the full expression of beauty, thought, and God. That what that does to preserving philosophy and understanding every facet of permutation of thought as much as possible. That specifically the community of Al-Andalus that he's born into in southern Spain. This is was it 12th century?
1165. He's born.
So this Andalus is in its heyday, right? Like there's so much going on. He's half Berber. And he's in an amazing area to soak up incredibly diverse thought and incredibly specific thought. And Al-Andalus is very fascinating because of its heavy Jewish and Christian population, and because of this, the I'm saying contagion in my head, and that's not what I actually want to say. The proximity to these other faiths and the preservation of the pragmatism of Berber lore for when you're traveling, and the respect that the Berbers are given, the Amazigh, that there is this effect upon Andalusian thought where more weight is given to Maryam and Isa, and because there's so many Christians, so they figure like, well, this must be something that we have to investigate. So Ibn Arabi is writing incredibly profound Christian mystery things because it's around him, and he's thinking about it and engaging with Christians to talk about it. And there is also this notion too, right, of like, as Andalus was a little bit more tolerant of, a lot more tolerant than many cities of people of different faiths, and especially still giving preference to people of the book. And written faith, and also keeping their caste system intact of like, not too many people are allowed to convert because Muslims get the taxes from the people who are not Muslim. But incredibly advanced cities, plumbing, heating, all these things are provided. It's a quite impressive time to be a Muslim in anywhere within the world, but certainly southern Spain has this propelling force that happens for him to be the great reviver, the friend of God, the greatest teacher, right? These are the unlimited mercifer.
I mean, Miguel Palacios wrote a whole book called Sufism is Christianized Islam, a study of Sufism through the works of Ibn Arabi of Murcia. This is something that scholars still equate Ibn Arabi with, and even as I was mentioning earlier, this very sort of individualistic connection that every person has with the divine through the wajh, or the face, or their Lord, who is this intermediary. I mean, this has a kind of Christian flavor to it, I guess you could say. I can see why people would say it.
Yeah, there's a John T. Little has written a bunch of stuff on Al-Arabi, but a line from one of his analyses particularly struck me about like how Al-Arabi is like past or like what he is, what school of philosophy he's pigeonholed into. And Little says Western scholars in their attempts to categorize Ibn al-Arabi's complex system have tagged him with several labels, including pantheist, pantheistic monist, parentheist, existential monist, and exponent of what is called natural mysticism. The doctrine that has earned him those designations is that of, wadat al-wujud, the oneness of existence, or the unity of being. This this idea that like you can say everything's one, and they're like, but what do you mean by that? What kind of everything is one? Let's put you in a let's put you in a department where you can't talk about
he becomes so much this darling of the perennialist school, right? Of René Guénon and so many of these figures who see all of the religions as kind of embodying this one single truth, and I mean they eat this stuff up. Whether he deserves to be that darling, you know, I'm not going to say, but yes, many people have projected onto Ibn Arabi a variety of things, a plurality of things.
So we've been talking about his writings and his ideas. I wanted to ask either of you if there are any particular like biographical details of Ibn al-Arabi that you're especially interested in. I like this story of how he supposedly goes into his religious seclusion at 16, which is supposedly at like some dinner party where he's like, it's Abra Ahmed Shahi in their biography says he was about 16, and there goes a story that was heard about 150 years after his death, that he was at a dinner party which rounded off with wine, and as he took the wine cup to his lips, he heard a voice saying, "Oh Muhammad, it was not for this that you were created." That's in like in Hadas, and this gives him the urge to quit worldly pursuits and embark upon the search of God. There's another thing we can get to in a minute about after he dies. I'm always fascinated by like inverse hagiography and how, you know, noble occult philosophers become terrible necromancers as soon as they're dead and can't defend themselves. There's a story about him marrying a jinn wife as well. But I was wondering if there are any particular like biographic details other than like where he was born, which is already, as you've said, Jesse, like an extremely interesting and thriving kind of place.
I mean, wine is such a staple in the Sufi tradition, in particular the Persianate Sufi tradition, as a
Right.
symbol. Although it doesn't always take on that particular context. That's a really, really good story. But I mean, wine makes me think of Khidr, and much of my research into Ibn Arabi goes into his relationship that he had with Khidr, who is essentially this non-incarnate spiritual teacher, his greatest teacher. What did you say?
Para incarnate.
Yeah.
He can take physical form.
And wine being connected to the waters of immortality in some sense, due to wine's intoxicating nature, and due to it being the inspiration of the poets. And Khidr is very much, this is his, these are the waters that he walks upon and swims in, if you will. And Ibn Arabi had quite a few interactions with Khidr throughout his life. And Khidr, in his tricksterish ways, Ibn Arabi was like, is that Khidr? Is that not Khidr? But eventually dons the cloak, and this is something in Sufi traditions, to don the cloak of your murshid, or your teacher, is to become one with them in some sense, which gets into lover and beloved dynamics, which is also an important thing in Sufism. But the wine and the elixir of immortality, or the waters of immortality, erode these boundaries between the two, and bring them together into the one, or as you mentioned, Al, the wahdat al-wujud. And this interaction between Ibn Arabi and Khidr, I find to be his most intriguing biographical details for me personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really describe much about Khidr. It's worth mentioning that he isn't named explicitly as such, but he's thought to exist in this conversation with Moses in the 18th chapter of the Quran. Surat al-Kahf, the cave, where Moses is brought to a kind of state of perplexity or aporia, as this figure who is thought to be Khidr. They move through this series of interactions where Moses is told to pay attention but to not question, and of course Moses questions, and Khidr ends up through this sort of esoteric dialogue, revealing to Moses that he does not know in reality the nature of what he has seen, and that the nature of the interactions that they went through together go far deeper and are far more complex than Moses could ascertain from the particular instance. And of course, this is an interaction which is invoked many times in esoteric dialogues as a distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric. And Khidr, in his interactions, continues to take on this tricksterish role as a teacher, wherein he does not teach in a linear fashion by any means, and his very precarious position as someone who is both embodied and not embodied is similar in this way, right? So I mean, for a figure like Ibn Arabi, a religious and philosophical genius, unlike essentially everyone in his time and around him. I mean, who else could teach him but Khidr, who is this liminal trickster figure, who is alive and not alive, who exists in this state of constant becoming and imagination that we call the barzakh, and is the inspiration for so much poetry, as well as the constant revitalizing of the word and of imagination. And this is his reference as the green man, right? The green man being the one who can continuously revitalize things, can wherever he steps, the verdant emerges, right?
The verdancy of the world, and
Yeah.
and it being in and out of the particularities of embodiment or conversation or the one or the current understanding you have of what you are talking about. Yeah. For folks who aren't aware, Jay actually did a whole class on Khidr for the Mighty Dead series that the Cauldron Black did, which I believe is on their class archives as a recording. People can get into that if they're interested in hearing your dulcet tones explicate some awesome and verdant ideas.
Yeah, it's linked on my website. That's a really, really great class. And I've been doing more and more research into Khidr through my grad studies, in particular to Mughal depictions of him. And that's something that I'm going to be talking about more
Ride
and
that
more
fish.
on my site and on the Patreon. But I did want to mention, in the same way, Ibn Arabi's primary teacher being Khidr, this doctrine of or perhaps not a doctrine, but this notion of the insan al-kamil, which Al, you had mentioned we should talk about.
Yeah, the doctrine of the perfect man,
the perfected man, which is extremely important to Ibn Arabi's thoughts. And in Ibn Arabi's thought, the perfected man or the perfected person, I don't think there's a need to give it a sex or gender, is this being who exists in the same liminal space where we find Khidr in the 18th chapter of the Quran, in the cave, and in this realm which is referred to as Barzakh, which is an isthmus, or a division between what is oftentimes salt water and fresh water, or an isthmus, just anything that is a barrier between two places or two worlds. And Ibn Arabi is very it's important that the perfected person grows out of this liminal in between, which is the imagination. And for Ibn Arabi, this figure of the perfected person is this is where the manifestation of the theophany occurs. This is also extremely important for figures like Qurban, who go on to speak about Ibn Arabi, where God manifests, or the theophany manifests in this figure of the perfected person, as being the one who straddles these two worlds, the worlds of manifestation on one hand, or the terrestrial, and the divine world, or the world of potentialities on the other. The one who can stand between, if you will, Ibn Arabi considers to be the perfected person, and Khidr being the one who walks in this realm perpetually, who is the very embodiment of this world, which is evergreen, right? Because it's never it's not fully alive, and it's not fully dead. And this notion of verdancy comes from this. It's in constant renewal, and it's in constant proximity to the divine realm. This is why Khidr is Ibn Arabi's teacher, because Khidr is the one who can teach about what it is to embody perfection in this way.
And it becomes like from what I can gather, it becomes like a super important thing, not just for the theology of, if I put it like that, the theology of God, but also of like the theology of religion, right? Reading more of that article by John T. Little, he talks about how Ibn Arabi compares an object being reflected in countless mirrors to the relationship between God and his creatures. And so God's essence is seen as the existent human being, as God is the object and human beings the mirror. And what Little says is that means two things. Firstly, that since humans are mere reflections of God, that there can be no distinction or separation between the two. And secondly, that without God, the creatures would be non-existent, right? And especially when we bear in mind that you may see Allah in the mirror of Muhammad, peace be upon him, that Muhammad is the best proof of God, and thus by knowing Muhammad, one knows God, right? These become instantiated in a lot of Arabi's thinking on prophethood and on our reflections on those prophets.
Exactly. This being the place, the perfect person being the place of prophethood. And of course, the Prophet Muhammad, at least peace be upon him, in Ibn Arabi's mind and in the mind of all Muslim mystics and theologians, him being the perfect man or the perfect person. for his time, right?
Yeah, when the individual, it's Little says, when an individual understands that there is no separation between human and God, they begin on the path of ultimate oneness. The one who decides to walk in this oneness pursues the true reality and responds to God's longing to be known. So there's also that little thing, Jesse, we've been batting back and forth a little bit about, like, that which you are seeking is also seeking you.
The idea that this fighting the anamnesia, if you know, of playing on the anamnesis pun, but that Ibn Arabi's early distinction, right, between rational thought, which is taught, and an unveiling, which is Gnostic flash of insight, and that the unveiling of the different lights, which, although Corbin, as I hear him in my head, Corbin, is primarily dealing with Persian Sufism in Man of Light, but talking, you know, again, green is the closest color to God here. Green is not a primary color. Green is something that exists in the transition and closeness to the spiritual realm and the bridge between the two, and that Muhammad is perfectly green, and that because we cannot experience Allah's light, the Nur, here in this realm, that green is our closest expression. And that the unveiling of this also, if we're taking unveiling as revealing, then Jannah is, right, the Garden of Eden is that which is also jinn, right? It's hidden. It's the same root that
Exactly.
we can no longer see the garden. And the place where we are perfectly in greenness, in proximity to God, exists still, but it is a state. And this is where we see Arabi really starting to go from this incredible literalism, which he finds to be very dull, to understanding the importance of everything as metaphor and metonym, perhaps both, in the approach to the nature of ourselves, which is erasing and unveiling the lack of separation. That there is that greenness. It's an essential part of our nature. It reminds me of in Tibetan, the phrase rungbap, I think, is to sit back, to fall back into. That when you are, you know, in this attaining of enlightenment, quote unquote, that it's not something that you suddenly find. It's something you settle back into because it's always been your nature all along. And similarly to this, you know, we talk this kind of strangeness that can happen in the perennialists and even the pseudo perennialists like Blavatsky, of like the veils of Isis and, you know, seeing the nature of God. But this becomes like an active thing as opposed to the insights that Arabi talks about, that the observation of the natural world will allow for flashes, green flashes, which then re-garden yourself. It brings you flashes of the garden that you will go back to or already exist in some way. And this is the true state, right? Where visions happen, visions are perfect, visions are from God, and that anything that brings you closer to God is of God. And that this notion of, like, we joke with Iblis, right? And I love because I send them to Jay a lot, of the like, Sister Minnie, no, you must not do this when the cat is doing something wrong. We like, it's like, no, don't go in the bar. This is for Iblis. But, the real effort Ibn Arabi makes to put a correlation between our internal darkness, the silence of Iblis, the regret, but the truth that Iblis exposes, the hidden places within us as the potential where we must allow light to permeate, that the permeability of light in creation is the revelation of God, and that this is what unveils us, that things become true by the amount of light we just let come through. And that is what, for me, makes him Sufic, right? It's an inherent state already. But the body of light, if we're going to follow Corbin's thought, is still something that must be maintained and built, that we're not inherently immortal even, that we have needs of immortality, but the body of light as something that, like, Khadir, to build a green body of light. And if you're going to go into further examples that, like, obviously start to influence people like Gurdjieff and Ouspensky and the people of the fourth way thought, but that we are becoming human, that none of us are born fully human. We have not tapped the potentials of what our body is. what our clay is,
Mm.
and that it is our job as much as anything to breathe God back into ourselves, and animate the clay, animate the waters of populace, and bring something forth.
Yes, this notion of like sitting back into I want to say enlightenment, but like a hopefully a closer to enlightenment thing makes me think of is a passage when I was going through the one of the Ibn Arabi texts that gets translated as the 7 days of the heart, or just gets called daily prayers sometimes. It's the 14 prayers for the day and night of each of the days of the week.
Yep.
And in their intro, they're talking about just the difficulty of translating the term that sometimes it's just devotional prayer. Weird, W-I-R-D, Arwad in plural. They say it's difficult to translate into English because the Arabic root carries connotations of arriving, reaching, appearing, or being received. They say for the nomads of the desert, the root primarily refers to a watering place or well where travelers come to drink. And in the context of spiritual practice, the term weird itself is normally applied to private devotional prayers at specific times of day or night. And they're supererogatory acts, like, so they're in addition to the 5 prayers prescribed for, being a good Muslim. And yeah, just the idea of receiving as well, right? Of being watered.
Looking into the wine cup.
Right.
Oh, the taking on the mask of Layla, allowing the seed that is planted or the clot that is planted to bear fruit within you. And because this is the commonality, especially between rabbinical Judaism and Islam, right? There's that Allah is responsible for everything about you, that the God of Abraham is responsible for everything about you except your decision to be virtuous or evil. It's the one thing he will not influence, because that's you. So everything else is footnotable.
Don't blame me, bro.
Yeah. He's like, really, that's really what it is. He's just part of academia.
It's the opposite of the scorpion trying to cross the river on the frog's back. I didn't know what you were when I picked you up.
Yeah. So I guess the kind of bringing back here, and I think about this, talking about unveiling and insights and hidden things, brings us, because I do want to return to Lunar Mansions, because it's such a broad topic, and it's one that I know that is almost so broad it's almost a shame to ask you to talk about it in any short manner. But also by way of the moon card, which as far as our arcana go, the 2 little doggies howling, and there's a stream, and it's the opposite of an isthmus, actually. But the association still of deception, hidden things, unveiling, dreams that come with the moon card, the nature of illusion and deception that is heavily carried by the moon here, which is interesting because at least in the Rider Waite, it still has yod lights, right? There's still this primal flame of God that's raining down like nectar. So there's still truth, despite and I think I'm always going to bring up that it reminds me of the Neverending Story, the way those 2 towers are there. I always feel like sphinxes are going to like shoot their eyeballs at me. And specifically this lobster / crayfish / pseudo crab that is there, and the emotionality of that. But
the little yods invoking the semen mysteries once again.
The dew that impregnates
uh-huh.
but the making the white one red, as it be.
So the moon has like Waite says that it has 16 chief and 16 secondary rays, so it has 16 big little rays coming out of its face and 16 little ones, and then there are 15 fertilizing dewdrops of these moistures spreaded in this yod shape, which makes me think of like, is the 16th already like fallen to earth and is like already in the process of germinating or not?
That's because the 15 are the Beheni.
Okay, all right, yeah. There we go.
Good. Glad you said it.
Yeah. Jay's like, now I'll quote you, and I won't have to be told I'm.
I'm not in breach of contract.
There's a there's a lot of tensions going on in the moon, right? Like down to, is it 2 dogs or is it a dog and a wolf, right? And various people have speculated on how that's Lycos Lukos, like the wolf that is the light, versus whatever.
There are two wolves inside you.
Right, there are two wolves inside you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That looks uncomfortable. Yeah. So but the main tension really is like with the fact that the moon is the thing of night, right? And thus all those hidden enemies and danger and darkness and occult forces, but also it's the fear of those things as opposed to as opposed to their reality as well. We're back to the fundamental like phlegmatism of the moon and its ability to inspire the imagination, that like liminal mirror to be able to affect ourselves by the things we worry about or the hopes we have, the construction of like future events that we are now reacting to the construction of. We're creating simulacra or images made in the imaginal that are then provoking these the sense of the fears of the natural mind, as Waite puts it, right? That he says it's the card is the life of the imagination apart from the life of the spirit. So without that guiding like principle of spirit, we are at the risk of making a million monsters for ourselves.
There is this distinct difference between what we've been talking about with Ibn Arabi and humanity being the reflection or the mirror image of God, and the moon card, getting such a bad rap, not being this face and profile that is seen on the moon card in many of the decks, being less humanity more broadly, but as you're saying, Al, humanity's paranoias and fears and addictions, and the sort of connotation that the card tends to get, which I'm not sure is necessarily. I guess there's also connotations of dream as well, dream weaving, but it altogether tends to get a pretty bad rep, which I'm not sure is worth it. The following card, the sun, it's just even in the differences of the faces, as I said in the moon card being in profile or almost like a silhouette, and the sun looking directly at you, at least in the Rider-Waite deck, and the difference between these things, the sun in the tarot taking on more of the qualities of humanity without the addictions and the fear and the problems and the issues.
Right. If we were all just rational white people about this, then wouldn't it all be much clearer?
The sun. Welcome to the sun.
Well, yeah, I mean, Deadweight ends up saying the intellectual light is a reflection, and beyond it is the unknown mystery which it cannot reveal. So there's definitely this like privileging of the sun over the moon in that very
exactly.
But I love going back to this, off the cuff remark of the 15 being the Beheni, but we did talk about the moon's ability to harness the power of the fixed stars and bypass the planets in that way.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. That's canon for me now. Yeah.
Yeah. So like that idea of the Yods descending, I was like, I've never really given that thought before, but the moon's ability to be the mirror for that which is above it and disseminate it in a mitigated, nurturing, partera, midwifed way.
Yeah.
And the specifically the Rider-Waite's moon's expression is like, I can't tell, I've always wondered, is this a birthing pang? Is this a pooping? Like, why is that face so agonized? But
goodness, yeah.
There is now I'm really kind of liking the nectar that comes down that's like, I will be the filter, the catalyst for this other knowledge that's there.
But this is also the epithet of Iblis that Al mentioned earlier, which I can sort of see in this vein how the card gets a bad rep as the moon collecting the energies, gathering and piling on top of one another, all of these different energies, and the moon in the Sufic tradition oftentimes being associated with a kind of black light, like was mentioned earlier, the mysteries of the lights, seen most prominently in the Persian mystic Surah Vardi. You mentioned Korban and the black light, but this being this darker aspect, moon as gatherer of the lights and blackness and the black hole which pulls within it, you know, that is dangerous depending on what is being pulled into it. And if one is at that stage, in the same way of associating it with Iblis, it is purely, it is myopic, as Iblis is known to be, and it is not it is not giving out as the sun does. This is almost the entrapment or the danger which is needs to be, at least in this the mystery of the lights, needs to be passed through, the danger of passing through the stage of the black light and its absorptive qualities, right?
There's a piece of, like, and going back over old Waite on this card particularly, that he also talks about it illuminating our animal nature. And so on the one hand, you still have that, like, oh, the moon is the unconscious, is the subconscious, is all the stuff that we wash our hands of and repress rationally. But also he says that the message is peace, be still, and it may be that there shall come a calm upon the animal nature, while the abyss beneath shall cease from giving up a form. So there's also this notion that the moon carries within it, like, that settling into a tranquility, as well as all of the terrible, like, puppeting of our fears that it magnifies.
It's good you bring up this animal quality. This is particularly emphasized in the Greek magical papyri in the prayer to Mene, wherein the different lunar stations take on these animal forms, many of them being associated with Hecate in particular. But this is something that permeates the literature around the lunar mansions in general, these different animal forms that become associated with the different lunar stations. I mean, and this is not dissimilar to what Jesse's touching on with the constellations and the stars. I mean, the Beheni are particular stars, which of course exist in constellational contexts, but star constellations oftentimes being the forms of animals, right? And the different animal constellations that the moon, in its absorptive and mirror-like and reflective qualities, takes on these different these images, right? Which many of them are of these mysterious and chthonic dark dimensions of folklore and of magic and all of the things that go bump in the night, if you will. That's my favorite quality of the lunar stations, and I mean, approaching it from the context of the moon card and musing off of what Jesse was saying of the different yodes and their relationship with stars. It's like that is what a lunar mansion is. A lunar mansion is the moon's ability to reflect the starlight as well as the darkness around any particular star, to create a sort of third dimension in between. And one is doing lunar mansion magic, one is attempting to tap in through the language of images, letters and numbers also being images in my mind. One is attempting to tap into this in-between mirror-like space between the terrestrial dimension, wherein these different animal forms or embodied forms that we're talking about may exist in a more familiar context, with the way that they then exist in the darkness of the night sky, seen through the abstraction of constellations and star forms. The moon being this mediating force, like we've been talking about with Jibrīl and Populus and many of these other things between these dimensions, and this this starlight through the mirror that is the moon, or the observing the yodes through the mirror that is the moon. This is lunar mansion magic, as well as just what a lunar mansion is.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not described in that way. Like most lunar mansions would just be described as a breakdown of the same 360-degree movement of the sun and moon. But in reality, I think it is more of this interplay between the terrestrial and the celestial through this strange funhouse mirror that is the moon, right?
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of putting it.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is one of the beauties of the nakshatras, is emphasizing making sure that there is a star that governs each mansion that is less. There are certainly stars mentioned in Arabic sources and in some filtered down versions of Lunar Mansions, but the West's inheritance is primarily Muslim, and then as you're pointing out that there's an inheritance ultimately from the nakshatras, but this notion of a star governing each mansion or division in that way is very much evident in the nakshatras. Wow, that was a really long-winded way to say that. I'm sorry.
Oh no, absolutely.
That was that the 16th yod was in the mouth of the dog that's facing the moon, like a dog catching snowflakes. So I guess then with Lunar Mansions, and I'm gonna play the dumb one for a minute, because it gets called things like the lunar zodiac, right? Like there's still this notion of taking the sky and dividing it into a certain number that has equal segments, that already that equality shows that the people who developed the systems understood that this was not actually revelatory of the constellations, but was referencing constellations or markers within those constellations, because Pisces and Aries are not the same.
It was inspired by astrophysics rather than being astrophysics.
Yes. Well, yeah, and then all sciences owe their origin to astrology, right? Like that's the my 20th century concepts of space, time, and matter teacher at NYU. But The Sleepwalkers, is that the book? It's a really good book that goes into the history of like going through Mesopotamian through modern astronomy and everything that goes with that. But with the Lunar Mansions, it feels like their inclusion in any part of the Western canon, much like the Beheni, are solely for image magic, by which to obtain a certain amount of magical result. And one of the things that attracts me to Ibn Arabi's divisions is that there's also an inner work that then can be engaged with that is not just for exterior result.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly where we get it filtered by the time people are referencing Agrippa's 3 books. Like, while he does describe some of their complexity, the chapter on the mansions of the moon is literally like this 7th image is such and such, and it destroys a city, whatever it is. Yeah, it's very much boiled down to image magic by 16th century promulgation by this Swiss mercenary.
And Jesse and I were discussing this the other night, but I'm really fond of referring to the mansions, this kind of theatrical metaphor. And this is sort of how I see them or envision them. Besides the moon being mirror, each station. Another way that the lunar mansions are referred to is also as stations, like way stations or stops in the road of travel. Which I love that the moon card has this little path on it. At least in the Rider-Waite deck, it shows that the moon is associated with travel and as well, of course, with timekeeping. But thinking about this little like theater troupe moving through down the road, down the path, and each place that they stop, the performance is a little bit different and the crowd is a little bit different in each of these different stations or at each of these different homes. And I like the different ways that we might use the lunar mansions, as you're referring to them in this more mystical context with Ibn Arabi, as many have done, especially in a more very, very, very modern context with the nakshatras of like spiritual evolution. And as you move along this wheel, you're growing in more and more spiritual attainment. That's not something that I necessarily use or value myself, but I don't see why we couldn't ascribe it to the lunar mansions. But in all of these different ways, even going as far as like talking about the distinction between sidereal, which is not taking into account the precession of the equinoxes or the wobble of the planet Earth on its axis, in comparison to the fixed stars, like the lunar mansions are these places of gathering. Like we keep talking about the moon and how important it is that it is gathering and collecting and things being piled on, right? And the lunar stations or the lunar mansions are these houses where these gatherings occur. And as a part of these gatherings, all sorts of animals and spirits and personalities, as well as human dead, show up and choose to reside there. And I think what I love about the lunar mansions, that they're capable of holding all of these different things. Like you get the image magic where it's purely this results-based magic that you mentioned, of like you carve this image and you write the spirit name to get this results. That you can have that because those spirits who people have worked with the lunar mansions along those lines continue to reside in the home that is the lunar mansion, as well as all of the mystical associations, which perhaps are the writing or the calligraphy on the door to this home that is the lunar mansion. That the moon as this celestial body of collecting can hold all of these different things, and as it moves along its path in the sky, it's sort of like showing up at all of these places which are its home and constantly continuing to gather, which is why you can approach it through a sidereal angle, which is not tropical, meaning that it's changing with the movement of the fixed stars based on the precession of the equinoxes. Or you also don't need to use these roughly 12 to 13 degree divisions of the 360 degree circle, and you can go back to the lunar mansions and their original conception as not being evenly divided, right? Just as the constellations in the sky or the stars in the skies are not evenly divided in this way. Or you can use it as it is most often used in Western magic, with a clean tropical zodiac, which is, we're talking about stars. It seems a little bit strange, but people have used and continue to use more than anything else the tropical zodiac for the lunar mansions. And the tropical zodiac is a solar system, literally, mind you. So to use that for the moon and the stars and to get effective results from it is fascinating. But also goes to show how malleable these things really are, right? And how they can bend and form and shape, once again, the strange funhouse mirror that is the moon, to however people are interacting with said mirror, and reflect it back to them, whether it's like, I'm a Western magician who uses the solar zodiac, or I'm going to abandon all these things altogether and just like, look up and howl at the moon and do that kind of lunar mansion magic, which is its own thing.
Parallel, I know I've spoken with you at length about this, and probably on this show, but this and given a talk about it, which is on the thing too. So the precedent is set. But having quoted David Chaim Smith's kind of exploration of voice, breath, and speech as the kind of sulfur, salt, and mercury of a non-Lurianic Kabbalah, the Elun school, but that similar to of the consonants of Semitic languages being what is written down, and that in order to read them, you must animate them with your breath, which is transmitted. Your knowledge of how to pronounce is transmitted. It is both a text that can be picked up, but if you've not seen that word before, you do not know how to pronounce it. You must infer. You must have knowledge, which was originally transmitted breath to Adam and then so forth down, so that the divine order of things is ultimately breath and vowels belong to God, and that the clay of matter is likened to consonants. And so similarly with the projection of the 28 letters through the 28 mansions, you also get the fact that these consonants cannot be pronounced on their own. They must be animated by the breath of God, by ruh, right? So it is not making a sound in and of itself, because there's no vowels necessarily being added. However, that consonant, as I think it's Bookhart that actually goes into that, right? Of if one takes into account that the fact that the initial hiatus is not properly speaking a sound, but only a transitory instant between silence and locution, the series of sounds attributed to the lunar mansions begins with the hud and ends with the wow. These two letters composing the divine name Huwa, he, symbol of the essence, one and identical to itself. So there's this notion there, two things. I mean, the fact that Huwa is in there, and this is such a start of many Sufic circles, right? And Hu, Allahu. But the instance between silence and locution, the letter is itself an isthmus. And when observed and understood as the way that nature illuminates the perfection of God, that the isthmus that is now the letter and the breath and the filtering of the great universal that is there behind the moon is now animated by our recognition of it, and the ability to speak within that isthmus, to be greened by the light of the moon. The moon illuminates the essential greenness in that way of he who is we.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it's something I taught a class recently, attempting to make a connection between these very, very ancient drawings and signs in caves with stars and the lunar mansions, which of course I'm not the first to make that connection. Many people have speculated on these different dot patterns in caves and how they might be akin to proto constellations or stars. But I following the same notion that you're sort of getting at, of like what I've called the archaic language of the moon, which in some sense is just the observation that the light and shadow that the moon makes has forms and reveals different forms which look like letters. The new moon being the darkness, or an openness or a fullness, and the vice versa of that, the full moon similarly a closeness or a fullness, a half moon being its own thing, a crescent moon being its own thing, and this forming a letter up in the sky which may be observable. And this is to me the earliest example of how we can associate a letter with a particular lunar station, because the lunar stations are also the phases of the moon, of course. And like, as Al referenced, this connection between Jibrīl and language and the geomantic letters, as well as the revelation, of course, of this book of nature and the Quran and the holy texts, the associations of these different letters with the moon are akin to reading this book of nature, right? And it's going to look a little different for whoever is reading them, but this association goes very deep, and of course it goes deeper than just the Islamic tradition. As I mentioned, the Greek magical papyri also has this, where each of the lunar stations also has a sound associated with it. The first one being silence, which once again is that the full moon, is that the new moon. This could go back and forth, of course, but this gets into even more ancient notions of Egyptian magic and speech and magical speech, and a connection to Thoth, which once again, beyond the Islamic tradition, getting into Kabbalah and so many Western traditions of magic, you can see how the lunar mansions and their connection with magic can permeate it even beyond what was brought from the different Arabic texts, like the Picatrix, wherein Thoth and his connection with magic goes to this sort of lunar alphabet that is being discussed in all of these other texts. Like, there's many different approaches to this, and it's important that this notion of speech, or of the divine speech, can also be observed through the moon, and not just what we're doing. That the open mouth of the full moon is also the ah of Aleph, and the closed new moon is also the of the letter meme, and how these letters come to be associated with these different phases or stations of the moon. It's embodied in this way, in the sense that Jesse mentioned earlier of as above, so below, in the sense of interpenetration, as opposed to this exclusivity, which, you know, is so misunderstood, I guess.
Right, they're not running in parallel. Right, yeah, we're not just talking about a hidden world that has no that is a parallel realm that never touches ours and never has any influence or anything to teach us.
Exactly.
I like how you're emphasizing that notion of, like, it's, you know, the moon as teaching, as demonstrating, as instantiating these letters by which we may learn a fluency of nature and a fluency of speaking of God and with God, and just how that maps both onto or has very terrestrial implications, as well as all sorts of, you know, highfalutin stuff about what's going on in the celestial realm.
Yeah, it is inscribing directly onto earth. This is the first revealed segments of the Quran, right? In Iqra, like we've been talking about. This is the qalam writing with light and shadow into the terrestrial dimension. These are the God. This is God's speech revealing itself through light and shadow, right? And to be able to read this, to read the book of nature, read the letters in the moon, is very much Ibn Arabi's notion of the perfected person. The perfected person, the insan al-kamil, is the one who is able to comprehend these signs, right? It's not abstract and as highfalutin as we oftentimes make it, or as I oftentimes make it out to be, I guess. Like it is that.
I'm very struck by the way that these the terrestriality of this Lunar Mansion work in these early modern cunning workbooks, because it isn't image magic. You make a ring with some make various rings with some words on them, or a hollow ring that you write words out and put them in. But then the main thing is that you consecrate it and you trace letters. I don't even want to say sigils, because they're like they look more like sequences of and ligatures of letters are traced on the earth with the ring. Now you've consecrated it in order to, you know, make that meadow appear, or make those men appear in armor or whatever it is. But like you are touching it to your spittle, and then to the earth. You are tracing something out with this point.
It's like, what is, I think Carl Sagan got it from someone else. I know one of you will know this, but the two-dimensional versus the three-dimensional. Yeah, it's so flatland. Like that's totally the way that I see it. And that's like, you know, where this inscribing, this act of inscribing that we're talking about, whether it's the ring or whether it's the qalam in the terrestrial dimension, is like, we're in the flatland and Allah is in the 3 and the 4 and the 28th dimensional inscribing, and we're only getting what we're getting. But
well, that's part of the beauty, like, and because I can remember Corbin's still gonna say Corbin in my mind, but I'm trying to, you know, he was a Sorbonne educated man, but that the Alama Mithal, the imaginal realm, does not consist of things we think of. We visit the realm in our thoughts and interpret it through our mortal ability the best we can. That our imaginative faculties unveil the hidden reality that is, you know, beyond Mount Kaf, and that exists in that hidden world that we can't. And this allows for, building off of what we talked about last time, Al, even this concept of legion, that we are not perfect in our revelation. All revelation starts in the imaginal realm, in this esoteric philosophy, right? So this is an inheritance of Plato. This is an inheritance of Mandeism, of the world of light and the world of matter. But Alama Mithal is not something that we can directly perceive and interpret. It almost is the the problem where you can't observe the particle. You can observe the particle's place, but not its speed, or you can observe its speed.
Uncertainty. Yeah, Heisenberg's uncertainty stuff. Yeah.
Heisenberg is uncertainty principle. Wow, that's a lot of words.
Uncertainty. Yeah.
There's something to that similarly here that we can perceive but not describe, or we can describe but not perceive. And that the souls of this, or the population of this other realm, the realm that is sometimes said to be the continent Horkalia, is which is all lovely Ibn Arabi inheritance, and Al-Ghazali, which is a great book, right? The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
It's
such
bold.
a shady title, right? But
it's super bold.
I think this Orban's assertion is important to understand, that there is no way that our lowercase nafs can perceive the imaginal realm in the way that the uppercase nafs can. And that although all revelation and all unveiling is inspired by, starts in, and exists alama mithal, that it is impossible for us to claim that we are revealing the true revelation. And that this is part of the reassertion and reification of the seal of the prophets, right? That the greenness of Muhammad, peace be upon him, is not duplicatable. Like that the revelation was so big at that time that it is not possible to have as much revealed anymore, and because the world is not caught up to the revelation that is that revelation. So until the world actually works with what it has, there's no reason for us to all start perceiving the other world with a unified voice.
In that way, the imaginal is axial, right? And the concept of kutub in the Sufi tradition, or the axis or the pole, which has its own associations with these things we've been talking about around light and progressing through these different scales of light, and Jibrīl
as the North Star, which is a whole other thing we didn't talk about.
Yeah. But it's like it's at the center of everything. You're always moving around it. You're never it. You're always moving around it.
And even the perception and the accuracy, that knowing that Kutub as the North Star is moving itself, that it still orbits something that we can't see.
Yeah,
exactly.
It is not actually stationary. And this is the thing, is because it's called a stationary star across the board, but to understand that the observation is it's not stationary. It itself orbits, because it's not actually in the center right now.
Okay, so within that center, within that that sense of
the green center, if you will.
The green center, yeah. There we are. We're greening, and we're greening a beautiful tour guide. Let's talk Jade just briefly, since it's on the docket as well, right?
Yeah.
Jasmine, aka Oriental Jade, so it gets called in the European lapidaries.
That's all. I mean, I picked Jade out of sheer solidarity with my Mesoamerican friend here.
Oh, awesome! Yeah.
So
you brought up Mount Kof though as well, which is referred to as the Emerald Mountain, but why not the Jade Mountain as well?
Yeah. Right? And Jabuka and Jabusa are equally. Why not?
Yeah,
they don't have to be the Emerald City. They could be the Jade Mountain.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's just this greening as a concept. It is, although we can't say with certainty that it would be directly parallel to Mesoamerican conceptions, because we've lost so much frickin' interpretation because of colonization. Not what the episode's about. That Jade itself, and specifically Nephrite Jade, which is New World Jade, the green stone is life itself. And that this conception of watercolored, the color of that which nourishes, is locked into its mysteries. The like more very familiar with the course of like the Aztec Mexica Xochitliquechi, the jade skirt, which is the deity of fresh water, but this notion of jade itself, of being preciousness, that to have jade in your name implies preciousness or special properties that are worthy of being kept or hoarded even. I also am fascinated with, because the Aztecs inherit this obsession with jade, although turquoise itself, in the northern reaches of like where the Aztecs were from, the Four Corners region of the States, you do see the use of turquoise in the American Southwest as something very similar. Turquoise is considered to be the little brother or the lesser cousin of jade. It's not as valuable, but jade itself is not one stone. It's just things that look really green. And get called this nephrite jade, which is used in earplugs, in jewelry, in mosaics, that even the dust that's made from making other things is then reconstituted and pounded in with tree resins to make things green. That it echoes the sacredness of blue-green things like quetzal feathers, which the Tlatoani and the chiefs had these quetzal feathers decorating of things. There's just a small bird which makes two tail feathers that are like pheasant feather length, and they're blue-green. Very endangered because it only makes two feathers and they got hunted a lot. But the notion of greenness that is tied in this, I think is directly in the import and the intertangledness with the idea of life and a symbol of divinity, an evidence of divinity. That the votive axes that were thrown into the cenotes, which are these giant sinkholes, right, that contain water, that were always viewed as portals to the underworld, especially in southern Mexico and Central America with the Maya, of that we came out of the caves from the lower world. If you're in the Southwest United States, the Sipapu constants of the Hopi and the Pueblo of coming out of the ground and coming out of the Chichimostoc, the place of seven caves, but the womb of the earth is what birthed us into this current world. And that the preciousness of water, that blood itself is jade water, not because it's green, but because it's precious. So I think there's a lot there with jade. It is something that I think I remember. I wish I could find the quote, but there's a wonderful Frida Kahlo quote about like, "Don't fucking touch my jade," basically. And kind of her. She's a controversial figure because she's so popularized, and there's a whole other thing there. And Frida Kahlo is probably her own dead magician in her own right. But the fact that she's reclaiming her own Mexicanidad because she's half Hungarian, she's half Hungarian Jew, and she's playing up her indigenousness and playing on the cultures of her maids that she had growing up, and trying to kind of develop this other image, which is all born out of a socialist impulse in an early childhood of fucking shit up. But this life experience itself would be jade. This is all precious life. This is all precious water. That our interaction with the thing that makes life, that if we want to borrow from the other side of like that, God knowing the world through us, I think is really I'll stop there.
It has that khidr like quality to it. In its greenness and in its sense of revitalizing, and I think of it in the context of the jade masks for Maya rulers in their tombs, as well as these jade beads which are placed in the mouth of Maya dead, which continue in the same sense to revitalize and keep the verdancy of that particular being past the death of their physical body in this way, to keep them connected to this isthmus of the imaginal, right, this dwelling of khidr. And jade just has, I know of course jade was used for many different things, but in the context of the dead I find it particularly interesting, especially this notion of keeping it close to the mouth and everything we've been talking about with the breath. The day sign ahau for the Maya being linked to the flower which emerges out of the mouth, the flower, or even the butterfly, which is the soul of the dead person or of the person, and this green bead of jade being the thing which can continue to actualize this process, or to keep it fresh, even like a great piece of orbit gum for the dead.
The distilled precious nectar of life, right?
Yeah.
It's said in some of the medieval lapidaries that jade can cause the milk remaining in camels' teats to flow. So this notion of like spurring life especially like life for a desert creature is really interesting.
I could use some of that.
Although there of course, I just want to make sure I'm clarifying, because I can feel people that I know will be like, you misspoke. There is obviously an understanding of what quote unquote true jade is, nephrite jade specifically, and jadeite, that there are in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican jade. There's geological and social jade. The first one refers to jadeite, and the other one is anything that looks like it. So there was an understanding of the color itself bearing importance, and some of it is, they're not as rare as jadeite, nephrite jade, but it still carries the same social function. And here you see substitutions, right? Like this is what it is, and I think there's I remember early 20s and taking classes in Mesoamerican symbolism and color theory and things like that, and one of the things that you'll come across in Mesoamerican art interpretation is that it's such a weird mix of representational and non-representational, and because the color theory is not as evident, it's not European, is what I'm trying to say, and because the language itself thinks so differently, especially if we're talking about like Nahuatl or Chol or any of the Amerindian languages of Mexico. It just does, it phrases things so differently that like the idea of painting a deity in certain colors does not necessarily mean that that's the deity's colors. That women are painted in yellow. That's just how they're painted. And that there's the gemstones that were, this is showing certain qualities of things in the same way that, we all come up with symbols as to how our art language develops within our cultures. Every child draws a nose almost the same, but that is not how a nose looks in any shape or form. I mean, the sun does not look like a child's sun. So it's these languages of representation and communication, especially since the preciousness of language and what that is to the recent research, especially into post-conquest like Mexico City, to understand that the Aztecs actually had libraries, whereas before it was usually erased out and said that they were illiterate, but they had a pictographic form of writing that is incredibly, it's being studied more and more. Obviously the Maya had writing, and I remember being in 6th grade and being told that the Maya just dramatically disappeared. And I was like, I have family that are Maya. I'm confused what you're talking about.
Oh God!
But it's a strange. It's the disappearance of Native American inheritance of these continents is its own form of malefic magic, but through erasure. But it's just Jade is ancestry. Jade is the dead. Jade is so strong the dead for me that, like, wearing anything close to greenish turquoise or that green feels ancestral. It evokes it for me in a way that I don't know anything else that has that feeling for me. And it's incredibly, I wish that I could say that this is cultural, but I'm gonna be quite honest, this is just assumed, having learned a lot about the stone. And like although jade is a precious gift on both sides of my family, I have jade from both grandmothers. That was because they were children of the 20th century, and like in the 50s and 60s, like you wanted jade, and it came from China. But like now I'm like, it's like, oh, it's continuing an ancient ancestry that is like, I wish I could say that, but no. But for me, it is ancestry because of how much I've dedicated towards trying to learn what it is. No, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on, Jay. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, but I feel like we should have you back with your
yeah.
And if all goes well, we would love to honor your invitation to chat with you on your podcast. So
yeah, tell us a bit more about your podcast. What have you been up to of late, and what do you got planned?
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun, and I would love to come back and talk some more. I have a podcast called A Star Night Dwell, and Al has been on the show before talking about the Star of the Magi. It's a great show.
It was a lot of fun.
Seems like a long time ago. That was summer solstice of 2022.
Yeah.
Hoping to do more of the show. And of course, would love to have you both on. I have some ideas for points of conversation, but I won't say that yet. And the show tends to focus on a particular asterism, celestial phenomena. We've done stars, we've done planets and signs, this sort of stuff. And then hooking up with a guest who I feel like aligns with, or has a project that aligns with that particular phenomena. So like I said, Al came on and we talked about the Magi, because that's something that Al knows a lot about. And then, one thing leads to another thing, just like this conversation, and hopefully turns into greater and greater discussions. And it's sort of like finding a way to talk about lots of things with the stricture of celestial languages.
So in that spirit, just to reiterate, you also recently opened a Patreon.
Yes.
So that we can get things like a podcast out of you more easily. So we will link to said Patreon and any other links you would just to permit us to use when we do the show notes. We are always negligent ourselves at reminding that there's a name and there's a website for this podcast, radiofreegolgotha.com, that has all our old episodes and our upcoming talks and things like this that we are both doing. So that way, if you are hearing this in the distant future or the distant past, which would be kind of awesome if that was the case, that you may see what is current by going to the website, rather than have us trapped in time dangling a carrot of something that you can no longer attend. Unless, of course, it is recorded and you can visit, which is often the case with things given through certain partnered places like the Salem Summer Symposium, which is Swiffer now, right? It's Salem Witchcraft Folklore Festival. And or Cauldron Black, or any of the various permutations. I know Al has an extensive archive of, and an increasingly larger archiving of classes that he does. I'll get back out there eventually after I wish to be perceived more. I'm quite proud of our close circle of friends and chosen family, and our precious Jade spit into the mouths of our friends. Between us. And this is the part of the show where I say we are going to pull it all together through extended metaphor, as is our wont. So unless is there anything else that we need to do the housekeeping of? There's another Speakeasy the Dead coming out at some point. This is a tremendous success, I will say. Thank you, Jay, not just for the topics and the discussion tonight, but this is our third month in a row where we've actually gotten a podcast out. And I say that because it will happen. Done this soon enough. And that trend is lovely. And there's a lot of things that we would like to continue doing, and we're seeing how doable this actually is. So thank you for being a part of this and our continued experiments. We have our own, dare we say, Patreon plans that we're hoping to unveil soon. But go support everyone. Please go support people creating, thinking, art and philosophy, and doing more than just regurgitating. There's a lot of exposition of things that seem lesser known, that then go through trends of this is the thing, and it's it's the new natives thing that I despise about the kind of tourist anthropological ethnograph. But there are also a lot of people who are doing amazing things with what they see in all these things, and I will extol the strengths of the two people I'm talking to right now in that. I'm also talking to the audience, so it's very confusing. I will celebrate the crown of understanding that is the whatever mansion on the moon that is, that's also the fixed stars. Is what is it? I'm gonna remember. It is the 10th.
Oh, for Ibn Arabi, it is the
Yeah.
10th. Yep.
Yeah. Shin, right? It's the Shin. I say that because I have a Yod Shin
Yep.
as a name. But okay, so yes, that I'm grateful for the gifts of both of your brains in that things discussed are neither fixed nor fleeting, and that is its own isthmus that is very difficult to you can't teach it.
Yeah.
And it is perhaps a passersby thing, but it allows for beautiful connections, conversations, and unveilings that is rare. So I'm thankful for both of your friendships, and look forward to future talking with both of you together, apart and otherwise.
Likewise, absolutely. Yeah, no, two of my favorite folks to go on a moonlit long walk on short tangents with. Thank you both so much for stuff we've talked about tonight, and for your friendship and support, and all the cool stuff that you both get up to and that I get to help with sometimes.
Via populusing it all up and down. Yeah.
In the darkness, there is a path. It is on the moon card. And may all your revelations be unveilings, and remember, we are but imperfect memories of perfect vision.
I'd like to foreground that that even Idris took several times to learn the techniques of geomancy from the angel Jibrīl, and so I extol the virtues of regularly turning up to the things that you love to do, to learn how much more you love them and how to do them with more love. Well said, Al.
And well, the next time the dead magician obviously has to be, even though this is not a dead magician, Khadir.
Yes.
And which is also my car's name. All right. With that, farewell, friends, enemies, lovers, all, and happy feast of Saint Jibrīl.
Happy feast, everyone.